Hello. So this is the post-debate stream. I realize I need to show people where this is. Can I still? Yeah, I should be able to put this uh, in the chat. This is not a very fun way to start a stream. Hang on. Yeah, so this is if anyone's wondering what this video is, this is just a live stream started up after the debate that I hosted between Subboor and Dave about Dave Farina about the is Darwinian evolution a fact? What am I doing? I'm just trying to get a link to this stream so I can link it to that. Here we go. Okay, so people can join in. All right, I think a couple of people have found this. All right, so let's see what just happened there. Yeah, so let me give a bit of context for why I was involved in the debate. So I mentioned this at the start, I debated Subboor Ahmad about 6 years ago when he was in Sydney about this same topic, is Darwinian evolution a fact? You can, that video is still linked on my YouTube, so you can have a look at it there. The debate went rather differently to this one. We talked a lot more about the science and a bit of philosophy of science from what I recall. But anyway, so Subboor reached out to me asking if I would host this debate with between him and Dave, and I didn't realize this at the time, but I sort of looked it up and I realized that there'd been a number of attempts for them to. I think it started with one of them responding to a video from the other. I can't remember which initiated it, and then there was some back and forth, and then there was talk about a debate, and there was an attempt to set up an in-person debate. I'm still not 100% sure I understand why that fell through. They've mentioned something about that at the end of his closing remarks, but I don't fully understand the circumstances. Anyway, so Subboor reached out to me as someone he knew who he thought might be appropriate to moderate, presumably because he was happy enough for me to do it, and because I'm an atheist and I debated against him on the same topic, so that sort of makes me relatively acceptable as a third party. Anyway, so that's why I was involved, and so I knew it would be sort of fairly heated given the back and forth between these two. So I did my best to keep it like on topic and at least someone engaged on the issues. So I'd be interested to hear what people thought about the issue. Because the topic is at heart actually interesting, because I think it does get to issues about like explanations in science and the nature of biological change and how we understand the importance of different mechanisms and things like that. So that you would have, if you just listened to the debate, you would have heard me a few times trying to get the speakers to engage with this central point about so Subboor's definition of Darwinian evolution was that it's the idea that the mechanisms of random mutation and natural selection can generate mind and body, which is the part that he disagreed with, that these mechanisms are sufficient to generate mind and body, as how I understood it. And I think something like this is, that's precise formulation is his, but I think that this is something like what other opponents of the sort of modern synthesis have objected to, the idea that the mutation and natural selection and the action of genes by themselves is sufficient to account for all of biodiversity and evolutionary change over time. And so they postulate additional mechanisms. And this is something that Subboor and I discussed in our previous debate, this idea of this extended synthesis, which includes a wider variety of mechanisms like niche construction and epigenetics and evolvability and things like this. I don't think all of those were mentioned today, but so there's a number of different aspects to it. So there is an active scientific dispute here about how to understand which mechanisms are most important and how to understand the agents of change. So someone like Dawkins talks, as I understand it, Dawkins talks about the selfish gene, the idea that the genetic material, the genes themselves, are the crucial causative agent, like they're the key mechanism that operates to bring about change. And one of the points that Nobel raises, as I understand it, and that Subboor mentioned, is that genes themselves don't actually do anything. They need to be placed in the context of a cell in order to have any effect on the world. So they are the instructions, in a sense, that the machinery of the cell then carries out. So you need a cell to produce a new cell. And so That's what I understood Subboor was talking about when he said that the genes are not sufficient to create mind and body, because you need a cell to execute the instructions that the genes provide, and then the cell itself, such as through epigenetic modifications or changes to the somatic cell, or the environment in which the cell is in, can have an influence on the way that the genes are expressed. Now, there's a question about to what extent those things can be inherited. And I think that this is Dawkins' key point, and Dave mentioned this briefly, but he didn't talk about it too much, which is that yes, other things like changes to the cell or the environment in which it's placed obviously can affect the cell, and it can affect the way it expresses the genes, but those things won't be inherited. Or if they are, they're only briefly inherited, like epigenetic mutations, changes in histone modifications and things are, from my understanding, only inherited for a couple of generations. They don't last for a long time, but I'm not 100% sure about that. So anyway, that's what the key dispute is, as I understand it, like the scientific dispute, which is how to understand how primary the role of the genes is as a causal mechanism, and whether we should think about other factors as being also important, and to what extent other mechanisms can lead to heritable change, inherited change. So just closing a few excess tabs here. Yeah, and so I think that's actually quite interesting. And someone mentions in the chat here, so was Dave aware of Subboor's angle at the debate? He seems to be taken aback by what Subboor brought up. So, I mean, I don't know. My opinion here is that Dave didn't do a very good job at responding to Subboor's key arguments. I also think that Subboor could have presented them more clearly and added a lot of rhetorical flourish, which, I mean, obviously he wanted to do that. Like, despite my warnings, both of the speakers added quite a bit of that. I can only do so much, right? But the point is that I think that it's clear that Subboor was arguing that the mechanisms of natural selection and random mutation are not sufficient by themselves to account for biological change, biodiversity, and so forth. And I don't think Dave really had a clear response to that. He sort of said, yes, there are other mechanisms, but those are part of or understood within modern evolutionary biology, which is sort of broadly true, but it's also still somewhat contested as to how important they are and how to emphasize different accounts. This is the whole idea of like an extended synthesis, and there's dispute on whether this is necessary or not. So there is active scientific disagreement about that. But the other thing is that the way that Subboor characterized the topic of Darwinian evolution was essentially saying that these mechanisms, like the mutation and natural selection, those are sufficient. So that's how Subboor defined Darwinian evolution. And I think that you can potentially challenge that. But that gets back to the semantic dispute about how you define these different terms, which I think both of the speakers spent a fair bit of their initial remarks talking about, which personally I think is relatively unhelpful as to about like exactly what counts as which. Dave did show a diagram which I thought was helpful of a Venn diagram with different terms or different mechanisms or aspects, and which of them are subsumed within Darwinism versus neo-Darwinism versus the modern synthesis. And probably you would add to that like the extended synthesis, but people use these terms a bit differently. So I think that probably looking at that would have been more helpful. Actually, let me bring that up, because I think that was one of the most useful slides in the debate. So sorry, this is just my screenshot here. Yeah. Oops. Hang on. Why do I have two? Let me close that. Do I have this open twice? I think I've got this open twice, but I don't want to close one in case that destroys the stream. Anyway, so you see here this idea of Darwinism as being fairly restricted in the mechanisms or aspects that it includes, and then neo-Darwinism includes aspects from genetics. So this refers to so Darwinism would be like, mid-19th century, what Darwin actually talked about. Neo-Darwinism would be early 20th century, turn of the century, with additional aspects from population genetics and Mendelian genetics. The modern synthesis includes a wide range of additional aspects, but I think it's a bit it's not entirely definitive what's included in the modern synthesis and then what's part of the extended synthesis. So like evolvability is often, I think, considered to be outside of that. But anyway, this is what makes the topic. I mean, I don't like this debate topic. I think it's a bad topic because it largely boils down to what you want to define as Darwinian evolution as distinct from like non-Darwinian or neo-Darwinian or extended synthesis and other types of evolution. So I didn't actually know until Subboor mentioned this, that there were a number of other debate topics that had been proposed. Obviously, I'm not privy to the exact history of who said what and what was selected. I think it would be much more interesting actually to debate the topic of is common ancestry true, for example. Because I think Subboor indicated he doesn't have a. Actually, can't remember exactly what he said about that. I thought he said he didn't have an issue with that, but I'm pretty sure he doesn't believe in full common ancestry. So I'm not sure there. But usually people who, at least I'll speak more generally in my experience with people who are uncomfortable with certain aspects of evolution, they usually have an issue with the idea that humans share a common ancestor with other animals and that all life shares a common ancestor. So that could be interesting to discuss as an issue, because that's something that isn't disputed scientifically. So that could be a more interesting discussion there. And another topic would be something like, does I think that the other topic that Subboor had listed was something like, is intelligent design science? Now that could get bogged down into definitional debates about science, but I think more interesting really is something like the idea that does evolution need a guidance, or does it need a director to bring it to the situation, where we have the modern diversity? That could be interesting as well, because this is typically what people argue. Not even even people like Francis Collins, who is theistic evolution is the term that he uses. So he talks about the idea that evolution, like he accepts evolution, but he thinks it has like a guide, a designer who guides the direction. That would be an also interesting topic, because you could argue specifically about whether the known naturalistic mechanisms by themselves are sufficient to account for modern diversity and the various phenomena. I think those would be more fruitful topics. I think that this topic about is Darwinian evolution a fact? I mean, it's related to those. Like it has, it definitely has a lot of issues in common, but it's, I think, fraught with the difficulty of getting bogged down in what counts as Darwinian evolution. And I think so. To summarize what I was saying, I don't think Dave did a very good job at, like, even though he sort of had this diagram, I think he had the starting point there to really make this clear about what Darwinian evolution is and what is a fact versus what's sort of still debated. But I just don't think that came through very clearly. And I think there were times when he had opportunities to like clearly articulate what his view was. Like, I don't know exactly what his view is on the dispute here, but it seems like he didn't have a clear position that he wanted to argue for, which like is sort of fine. But in a debate like this, you kind of like, that's the whole point. You need a position that you're defending. So I think that was a weakness to his case. Now, what I'll say about Subboor is that a lot of what his remarks were framed around attempts to create a gotcha moment for Dave. I mean, and that wasn't really disguised at all. Like he sort of said that explicitly, which is a tactic I don't like. And I think that it's not really very helpful to a debate like this. That being said, I think that Dave should probably be better prepared for that, because I think often, so I think what you have to do for that is you either just have to accept it, or you just or you take it and use it as an opportunity to make a point that you wanted to make. You don't just, well, like in a debate context, I think it's not advisable to just sort of allow your interlocutor to determine the course of the discussion, like constantly posing questions to you, like, do you know what this is? And then putting them in the position of explaining something to you. That's not a position you want to be in. So you can take that back, for example. So you can say, no, I'm not familiar with that, but how is it relevant? And then after they say something, you can say, but you went on about this, but this doesn't actually establish the contention you want to make because X, Y, and Z. You have to very clearly show why, from your point of view, whatever they've talked about isn't relevant, or you can go on and make a different point, right? But yeah, essentially, I think that Subboor did a better job at being a debater than Dave did. Dave was mostly interested in talking about the science, which kind of makes sense. I guess that's sort of his thing. But yeah, a debate has a certain structure and rules to it. And although I don't think either speaker did an ideal job at adhering to that, I think Dave didn't clearly have an argument that he was trying to push through the debate. So he didn't take the opportunities to make that point. Whereas I got a clearer sense of what Subboor was trying to establish, which was that those mechanisms that we talked about, the Darwinian mechanisms of mutation and selection, are not sufficient to account for mind and body, which again is very vague. And that's something Dave should have pushed at. He should have pushed at Subboor to be more precise about what he means by that, and to explain more clearly why those mechanisms are not sufficient. And then so if Dave wanted to argue that they are, what he should have done is made the arguments as to why they're sufficient. So Dawkins makes that sort of case, I think. So you could appeal to him. You can simultaneously run an argument that those mechanisms are sufficient or mostly sufficient, and also that Subboor is presenting an unfair definition of Darwinian evolution. You can do that if you want. So it's important not to get sidetracked by definitional disputes. But so you can kind of run those in parallel throughout the debate. So that might have been a good strategy. Dave kind of did that because he did bring up the point about definitions a number of times. But you have to be really clear about why this is damaging to your opponent's case. I think probably it would have been good for Dave to do, given his position, would be to highlight how much Subboor has conceded, and say, look, this is what he thinks is a fact. This is what he thinks is a fact. This is particularly, it depends on which audience you want to appeal to, right? I think Dave was mostly interested in appealing to his own audience. But if he was interested in appealing to some of Subboor's audience, I think what would have been strategic for him is to highlight all of the things that Subboor was conceding in terms of evolutionary theory. The reason that could be strategic is because I think that a lot of, and this is supposition, I don't know, but I suspect a lot of Subboor's audience is probably actually not happy to concede a lot of those things, or at least uncomfortable with it. So if Dave highlights all of those things and then emphasizes what Subboor is actually contending and frames it as being really a very minor point, a very subtle issue that scientists debate about, but actually kind of for many purposes doesn't matter, that could have been an effective way to frame Dave's rebuttal. But as it was, I don't think we really got a clear sense of that. Yeah, he sort of said that at times, but I don't think it was clearly emphasized or really articulated very well. So that's an angle that I might have gone down. Yeah, and then another angle is to debate those mechanisms more specifically. There are a lot of technical details there, though, which can make it difficult. But if your interlocutor raises technical points or words that other people aren't familiar with, you have to really call them out for that and bring it down to the essentially emphasize the fact that they haven't actually explained. Referencing something is not the same as explaining how it supports your point. So you really have to call them out for okay, but how does so there was what was the point that Subboor made a number of times? I think it was somatic hypermutation was one of them, and genetic assimilation. Actually, that's the one he went on about more. This is the idea that certain types of mutations can be assimilated or can lead to certain types of somatic mutations can lead to can be assimilated or can lead to changes in the genome. I don't fully understand what that mechanism is supposed to be or how that works or how well it's accepted. So what Dave could have done better is to really draw out that point and ask Subboor to articulate. Well, the thing is, you shouldn't really be asking your interlocutor for anything in the debate. You should be telling your audience why they're wrong, which is something that I think both of the participants fail to do a lot of the time. Is that you're not really there to persuade your interlocutor, you there to persuade the audience. And so, so Dave should have been really telling the audience something like, "Look, Subboor mentions these ideas about like genetic assimilation, but he hasn't explained what this is, nor has he explained how it's actually how it actually follows from that the genetic material is not sufficient to create mind and body." Like he could have then argued, look, just because there are things that affect the genes doesn't mean that the genes are not sufficient to explain mind and body. And so you have to keep bringing the points back to your core argument, right? That like, okay, the genes are sufficient. Here are the things that Subboor has been talking about. Yeah, those can have an effect on the genes, but it doesn't change the fact that the genes are sufficient. Like that the genes themselves are the central nexus through everything else goes through. And I think that is the point of Dawkins in the selfish gene. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts on the issues there. So I'm sort of they both lost the debate. Well, you have to remember that people have different purposes of participating in these debates. So lost sort of presupposes a certain objective there. I do think that both speakers struggled to articulate and consistently defend their core thesis. I think that Subboor did a better job at that personally. But I think that a lot of what he said was peripheral to his core thesis or was not clearly linked back to it. Another thing that both speakers did, I think Dave did this more in his rebuttal than Subboor did, is yield some of their time. In a debate, you pretty much never want to yield time back because that's time that you have to say why the other guy is wrong, right? And like that's the whole point of a debate. So you should always use all the time that you have. So like that's another aspect where I think that maybe Dave had less experience with these sorts of formats because I think he only used about 6 minutes of his rebuttal and also didn't find it very, very structured. But like I think that both of the speakers were mostly interested in appealing to their own audience. So Dave's audience consists mostly of people who are interested in science. And so when Dave talks about science, they like that. A lot of what Subboor says, like he mentioned a few scientific ideas, but a lot of what he said was more philosophical. I think Dave's audience is probably less interested in that and are going to side with Dave when Dave essentially says that like that's all nonsense or it doesn't matter without deeply engaging with it. And likewise, I think a lot of Subboor's audience is pretty critical of a lot of the science and is less interested in what Dave has to say about it and is going to side with Subboor when Subboor raises critiques, which then are not fully engaged with by Dave. So, you know, if each speaker is appealing to their own audience, then maybe they got out of it what they wanted to. I'm interested in a genuine exchange of ideas. And I think there was a little bit of that. I did get them to talk a little bit about this core issue of like, you know, do genes... I mean, I don't like Subboor's formulation, but do the genes through mutation and selection cause mind and body? I don't quite like that, but if we're going to take that as the core disagreement there, I did get them to kind of engage on that point, and it was so that there was something there, but it wasn't very satisfactory. So this point here about the mind point. So Dave mentioned this very briefly, I think right near the end, about the importance of mind here, because evolution, I mean, I guess there's evolutionary psychology, but evolution doesn't talk so much about the mind. It's usually more focused on like physiology, and it's unclear whether by mind and body Subboor is making some sort of dualist reference here, like he thinks there's more to the mind than just like the physical brain or something. That could have been something that that Dave could have mentioned, although yeah, it does potentially broaden the topic of the debate quite a lot. Anyway, so I'm just going to have a look. Feel free to share your thoughts of the debate in chat. I'm just going to... Oh, I see people have been doing that a lot already. Let me just have a bit of a look through. Okay, this was a fair point. Can someone lay out Subboor's beliefs about evolution because it seems all muddled to me? Well, I can't tell you what he actually believes about evolution. I can only tell you what he says about it. But so I sort of tried to do this before. But so from what I can understand as to what he was defending today is... a position something like, I mean, I think he was essentially defending Nobel. I forget what the guy's first name is. Nobel's position, which is Dennis Nobel, which is that common ancestry is true. Change through mutation and selection occurs. So kind of all of those aspects of the standard evolutionary view are correct. I don't know that he committed to the idea that I don't know if he committed to the idea that 100% all of that he has to affirm. Like, does he have to affirm that humans also evolved from a common ancestor with other apes? I'm not sure. But broadly, I think he affirmed most of that. What he disagreed with is the idea that those mechanisms of mutation plus selection acting centrally through the genes, the change in the genetic sequence, are sufficient to account for all of biological change or the development and like the development of all of the different biological forms. So he thinks that additional mechanisms are required. And some of these mechanisms he talked about, one that he mentioned, I think there were two that he mentioned most, was genetic assimilation and somatic hypermutation. I don't really know what somatic hypermutation is. I talked briefly about genetic assimilation. In our previous debate, he talked about things like evolvability and niche construction. I think there were some others, part of what is sometimes called the extended synthesis. So these are additional mechanisms that some biologists have postulated to move beyond just the idea of mutation plus selection. So that is what I understand Subboor was defending today, which is, again, I think actually quite specific, and he's granting quite a lot to like people who believe in evolution. And I think that Dave really made an error here. I mean, again, he sort of mentioned this, but he didn't emphasize it strongly enough. It should have been very strongly emphasized and constantly called back to throughout the debate, that Subboor is granting nearly everything that that evolutionists sort of talk about, like G-system evolutionists, that they argue about, and he's essentially quibbling on some mechanisms and the relative importance of them. So that's probably the approach that I would have taken if I was Dave. Yeah, so that relates to this point here. Well, and so this point is interesting about his the idea that Subboor starts from Islam and then works to find faults in evolution. Now, as much as I hate to say it, that the idea that you have a starting point, if that implies, if his view of Islam implies that evolution is false or is not completely correct, then it's not like wrong to try to find faults with evolution. Like, if you have a starting point which says that, if you think A and A implies that not B, then you're going to try to figure out, why not B, or what is wrong with B, right? Now, you could argue how justified it is in the starting point, and obviously we're going to differ on that point. But the thing is that in my debate with Subboor, I actually sort of pressed him on this, and he said near the end that he doesn't think that. I don't want to misquote him because I don't remember his exact words. This was a few years ago, but he said something along the lines of he would be sort of happy to just take an anti-realist position towards evolution, towards like the whole science of evolution, and not really get involved in like debating the specific mechanisms, and just take a philosophical anti-realist position, like to not think that it's a literal description of reality. I then challenged him as to whether he would take the same attitude with respect to other scientific theories, and I can't remember what his exact response was. I mean, you can check the debate out for yourselves. So this is much more of a philosophical objection than the specific disputes about the science. So I don't know what his actual view is about what he thinks about these things, but it seems to me that it is theologically motivated, which again is not necessarily a problem. But I mean, you just, in order to be justified, you need to have like really good reasons for believing the theology rather than what science tells us, right? And I mean, I just obviously don't think that that's going to be the case. I agree with this point about the name dropping. This is something that Craig does, William Lane Craig. For those who don't know, this is a Christian philosopher and apologist who I often talk about because I'm most familiar with his work. I wrote a book about his work. But Craig does this a lot in his debates. He name drops and quotes. Subboor did this a number of times. Dave critiqued him for doing it quite a few times. I don't think that Dave explained why this is a problem, and I think that this reflects a difference in audiences. So in my experience is that people from religious backgrounds are quite used to sort of name dropping and quoting. And this is done a lot in Islam in particular, right? When you quote hadith, and then you say like, where they come from, like I forget the word that they use, but the sequence of the witness, the attestation to the hadith, as well as quotes from the Quran. And it's not too different in Christianity, where you quote from the Bible, or maybe even church fathers and other prominent theologians and so forth. And that's just much more rarely done in science. I mean, of course, you sometimes quote other scientists, but the idea of like appealing to an authority is much less widely done. Normally, if you refer to something, you'll refer to their results rather than that the scientist said a thing. So I think that partly reflects a cultural difference there about what's deemed like convincing evidence. And so this is why I think it's an issue of appealing to the audience. It's very clear that Subboor was trying to appeal to the scientific credibility of Denis Noble. He talked about the fact that he had a PhD from Oxford a number of times, or like worked at Oxford, I forget which one it was, and the Oxford University Press published his book. Now, none of these things are actually relevant. They're pure appeals to authority, but like it's clear that he thinks those are going to be persuasive to the people who he's trying to persuade, right? And Dave was very dismissive of that. I think the problem with just being dismissive is that you need to explain to people who do find those things convincing why they shouldn't be convincing. I mean, Oxford and Cambridge University Press publish a whole bunch of crap. Their business is interested in making money. The question is whether the arguments are any good. So let's ignore the credibility stuffing and just focus on that, right? You need to sort of push that a bit, I think. And so, yeah, the name dropping is an aspect of that. But I think it's often hard to deal with in a debate because you often sound petty. It's like, oh, well, you're just sort of jealous of them, or you're like, can you dispute that they said this? No. Well, then what are you arguing about? Like, you need to approach it in a way where it's clear why you're critiquing it, but it doesn't take over other things in the debate. Yeah, just appreciate some likes. It would be good to get a little bit of traffic to the channel. This was a bit of work on my part. By the way, I had to get up quite early for this stream as well, so I'm going to be a bit tired today. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just working through chat at the beginning. Yeah, so Subboor did say quite a number of times about Dave being a coward. Dave a number of times called Subboor. Well, actually, I can't remember all the names he called him. I think he called him an idiot a number of times and similar sorts of things. Yeah, I couldn't really stop that completely. I did my best to rein it in. I like to think that counterfactually it would have been worse if I hadn't made the efforts that I did, but I guess no one knows that. No one can know that. Now, the point about the cowardice, though, is the reason I think Subboor was particularly emphasized on that is because he invited Dave to a debate in person and Dave didn't show up. Dave he posted a video about this. He has his reasons. He mentioned briefly about why he didn't. So I'm not going to take a side on that. That's why he's using that line. Just scrolling through chat here. Geez, very talkative today, which is good. This is a good point here. So I think the debate is about real teleology. I think that that's actually central to the dispute here. So it seems like, although he didn't, I don't think he used this term, but I think it seems like Subboor believes in a teleology to nature, which is probably derives from God, right? God's direction. And I presume Dave rejects that. It seems like that's what they really wanted to discuss, or whether there's evidence for teleology or something like that. I don't personally think teleology is a good word to put in a debate title, but yeah, that seemed to be at the root of their dispute there. So this is interesting, right? So I'm not entirely sure this was the point of the Kane who mentioned this, but I think that this is what I was saying before, right? That, I mean, this is the idea of evolving from monkeys is not technically correct, right? But if Dave wanted to press this, and I think that this would have been a good approach for him to appeal to Subboor's audience, right, is to press the idea that, oh, okay, so Subboor, you've agreed about common descent and all these mechanisms. So do you agree that you evolved from a monkey, right? So I don't think that Subboor is going to be happy to affirm that. And I think that, you know, if Dave was being a bit nicer, he would frame it in not quite such an emotive way. But the point is, Dave could have really, and I think should have, seized on that and pressed it really hard as to how much Subboor was conceding. Because I don't think that Subboor's audience has any idea how much Subboor was sort of conceding from the point of view of someone who wants to be critical of evolution, at least in that debate. And And I honestly think that Dave didn't really follow that, because Dave kept, especially in the open discussion, sort of saying that he didn't understand Subboor's point, or asking like, why is this relevant, or let's talk about the science. Not only is that not a good look in the debate, like just sort of not really following what the opposition is saying, but that means that you're not presenting your case. So Dave's case should be like, Subboor, you're affirming nearly everything that I want to affirm about evolution. You're only nitpicking these few points, and then maybe you can question why he's nitpicking those points, or you can explicitly then go into those points. Dave didn't seem too interested in that, but like there's different avenues you could have taken. But I think it's just sort of being bemused about not knowing what what Subboor was saying is not a very effective approach in a debate. I watched the debate to learn about evolution, but all I learned about was how much Subboor wants to be. Well, I won't finish that, but yeah, it's interesting that I don't recall Subboor mentioning Dennis Noble in my debate. Now, he may have, but if he did, he certainly wasn't nearly as prominent as he was in this debate. So that's interesting. Sorry, Nathan, if you wanted to clarify who you're talking about here, I think he was pretty dogmatic about that and incorrect. I think you probably are referring to Dave. I'm not sure what you're referring to. Or maybe you were talking about this point. Sorry, I'm still a little behind in chat. I'm catching up. I can see where the scroll bar is there. They said facts are like descriptions, things you observe or something, but like no observation comes with theory neutral. Yes, actually, that's something I disagree with Dave on. So Dave talked a bit about the idea of like facts and theories and things like that. I think that that's a fairly simplistic presentation of the relationship between observations and theories. And it's something that Subboor could have critiqued, actually. He didn't really talk about that at all. I think in a better debate, that would have been more central about what we can reasonably infer from the facts. And this could link to a scientific anti-realism point that like no amount of facts that no amount of fossils we can dig up or DNA that we sequence or any facts that we observe can ever uniquely determine one explanatory theory or one series of historical causes to generate that outcome. There's always a variety of possible other causes or explanations of how things could have come about. And this is the idea of the underdetermination of theory by data, right? You can always come up with other explanations. And if anyone is in doubt about that, just look at what the Christian apologists do when people point out contradictions between the Gospels, or at least many of them do. They come up with these most absurdly, wildly implausible stories to try to reconcile these. And that's an example of underdetermination of theory by data at work. Because, yeah, you can't prove that those things are wrong, right? It's always possible. The issue is relative plausibility, and that's where the issue comes out. Like, who has the best explanation, and how can you best account for the data? So that's what it would have been better to have. That's what I think is the interesting discussion. We almost got there a couple of times. I don't think we really got into it much, though. I'm going to agree with this point. So I assume this means Dave here. I don't think Dave was prepared at all. It doesn't seem like Dave spent much time trying to understand what Subboor was going to say or what type of arguments he normally makes. So Subboor has written a book about this issue. I'm pretty sure the book is out. That's a sort of, like, you want to have read that, or at least know a lot of its contents in going into a debate like this, especially a fairly high profile one. Like, this is something they've been talking about for a while. I don't get the sense that Dave did that. Now, of course, you can say, look, Dave wasn't really interested in debating Subboor's particular points. He just wanted to talk about evolution and talk about the science, which, like, that could, if that's your approach, that's your approach. I think, though, a lot of what he said was not actually about that, though. Like, that's an approach you can take. I've heard people take that approach with creationists before, though I want to emphasize Subboor was not actually making an explicit creationist argument today, so I don't want to, whether he is or not, that's not the argument he was making, but I'm just saying more generally, some evolutionists take the point that they're just going to ignore pretty much everything the creationist says and just try to articulate clearly what the science is about evolution and natural selection and so forth, in the hope that some people in the audience will be able to learn something that they otherwise wouldn't be exposed to. So that's one approach. If that is Dave's approach, I think, like, maybe some of his opening remarks were useful for that, but I think a lot of it was too fast. And there were too many attacks levied at Subboor for that to be very effective. But I mean, that's just my opinion. It's sort of hard to say with these sorts of things about what's effective, I suppose. So the word sophist has negative connotations, but I completely agree that Subboor is more of a debater. Dave is more interested in science. I don't think Dave did a very good job at doing debating. I think that Subboor did not do a very good job at explaining the science, but he did a better job at debating. Though, as I've said, I think that I had issues with the way that both of them conducted themselves, obviously. But I mean, look, it is an interesting lesson because similar things have happened with many other debates between scientists in particular and Christian apologists. Many prominent scientists are not very good debaters. Some of them are good public speakers. Like I think that Sam Harris is a good public speaker. I don't know that he's a great debater, but probably even a better example would be Lawrence Krauss. I've seen him debate. He's quite an engaging public speaker. I think he's an atrocious debater. Again, if you measure by the traditional approaches of a debate and what you're supposed to do in them, because a lot of the scientists think that it's just sort of sufficient for them to talk about science, but they don't follow the format of the debate. They don't carefully engage with the opponent's ideas and try to understand what they're saying and why they're wrong, and work it through systematically and clearly articulate that to the audience. Anyway, so I think this is actually a common failure mode for people who have an interest in science and want to think from a scientific mindset, but want to respond to a lot of material that has a philosophical or theological basis, whether that's in creationism or whether that's in points about like the New Testament and the resurrection, or whether that's about arguments from the design or fine tuning. I think that there's a common element in a lot of these that there's sort of a combination of the philosophical and the scientific that it takes a certain skill set to be able to effectively engage with. And I just think a lot of scientists don't have that. I think they could develop it, but a lot of them just don't have the interest, in my opinion. So I'm just continuing to look through chat here. I did not sleep very well. That's my excuse. Okay, let me tell you something, chat. So this is a debate that happened across 3 time zones, right? So Dave is somewhere in the US, I think. Subboor is in the UK, and I'm in Australia. So that's always an issue when you're scheduling things, is to make sure that you get the time right. But to make everything more difficult, literally this morning, literally like 3 hours before this debate started, is when daylight savings ended where I live. So I was like petrified that I was going to make a mistake about because you do the time conversions and then you're like, but hang on, because like what time exactly does daylight savings end? Because technically it's 3 a.m. and the debate was 6 a.m. my time. So like theoretically that's not a 1 hour. It's not like that hard a conversion. No, but when you have to get up early and you want to make sure you don't accidentally get it an hour wrong. So it just had to be that of all the days of the year, it was today, the day the daylight savings ends, that the debate was scheduled for. So anyway, that was a bit of fun for me to quintuple check that I hadn't made a mistake. Oh, this is a good point here. I always want a whiteboard or something that tracks the things they accept as the debate moves forward. Okay, so this is one of my things that I think is really interesting. So a very good debater can actually mentally do this, at least for themselves and, with a bit of paper, and they can map that out to the audience as you go forward. Like no one, in a complex debate, no one's going to have it 100% accurate, obviously, but like a good debater, Craig is generally fairly good at this, although I think he can sometimes be a bit manipulative, but that's a separate issue, right? Craig is generally good at this. What you have to do is hold in your mind all of the things that the opponent has said and what they've conceded, and all of the things that you have said and how they relate to each other. And then each time you speak, essentially map the things that the opponent has said to the issue of the debate, and say, look, okay, so they've said this, so that concedes this point. They've said that, which doesn't address this other point. And essentially what you do is just every time you're allowed to speak, you just say at least one thing from that. But ideally don't just repeat yourself, but develop it a little further, or in the context of whatever was just whatever the specific topic is. That's what a really good debater can do. Craig is very good at doing that. Though again, I think that because you can use that for good and ill. You can use that to help the audience understand and make your point better. You can use it for ill in basically kind of distracting from a substantive issue by just constantly hammering on the fact that the opponent hasn't addressed this issue or said that other thing or whatever, or sometimes even if they misspoke. Subboor actually, so this was a really good example. So I think it was this issue of when, like the date of the modern synthesis or something, which Dave said was in the 1920s. Okay, so this is something that I think was just a clear mistake from Dave, right? Because he didn't. I don't even care what the correct date was. I think it was earlier than the 20s, right? But like, doesn't matter. This is an entirely irrelevant point to the debate. So the correct thing, whenever something isn't relevant to the topic, you should just concede it, because it just means that the opponent, if they've argued for it, has wasted that time, and you don't have to spend time responding it. Everything that you can concede, you should concede, but don't concede too much, because obviously then you're in, then you'll have given the opponent more than you want. So you have to be careful about that. But this point about the 20s, like, absolutely can and should be conceded immediately and waste no further time on it. And you can even earn points there. So Dave can say, yeah, I made a mistake. I misspoke about that, and Subboor's correct. So you look humble there, and you look like you're open to changing your mind. So that's a good look. Subboor actually did this once. Dave just wouldn't do that. He sort of made a few excuses repeatedly about, oh, it was a live discussion, or oh, it was off the cuff. Now, in my opinion, that looks bad. It looks like you can't own up to making a mistake. Like the other option is you can dig in and you can just say, no, I was right all along. Like, I think that's a bad look as well. But I think the worst combination is to kind of admit, but not properly admit that what you said was wrong. And the problem is, because Dave didn't do this, it kept coming up, because Subboor kept using it against him. And this is very effective strategy. Like, I think that I don't think this is helpful for a good discussion, but it's an effective debate strategy, is when your opponent kind of, but not properly, admits to making a mistake. You can keep hammering them on it, which is what Subboor did. And I think this was just a big mistake from Dave. He should have, as soon as it came up, admitted, if he thought it was wrong, just say, yeah, I made a mistake, but it's not that big a deal, and explain how it doesn't affect anything, right? And then you move on. And then if Subboor brings it up, you can use the point against him, like say, oh, as I already explained, it was a mistake by me, but it's not relevant to anything, and so it doesn't help your case at all. And then you move on to something else. So then it becomes an argument from your point that supports your argument if the opposition then keeps bringing it up. So I think Dave really made an error on that one. I think there may have been a couple of other issues like this. Oh yeah, because there was, so Subboor then said something about conflating, again, I can't quite remember what he said, conflating genetics and epigenetics or something. I forget the details. So Dave mentioned this a number of times as well. Subboor caught it on like the third time or something and said, yeah, if I said that, I was incorrect, which is, I think, a very good response. He probably should have caught it a little earlier, but there's a lot of things that are being said, so it's harder to do that. You don't want to give the opposition a weapon any longer than they can have. So if there's something you can deflate like that, you should do it as quickly as you can. But that was a very effective way to deflate that point. But Dave just didn't do that with any of those sort of nitpick issues that Subboor raised. Yeah, this is what I was saying before. Most of Subboor's audience would reject natural selection, or at least a lot of what's entailed by it. I think that's the case, and so it would have been effective for Dave to really appeal to that more. Yeah, no worries. I mean, these ideas are interesting to me, and the process and the procedures and kind of rules and aspects of debate are also very interesting to me. So both of these are combined here. So there's plenty to talk about. I don't really understand the point of the debate if both of them seem to agree on everything except the deal about mind and body. Well, in some sense, you could say that's what they should have focused on, or at least that's what it would have been good to focus on if we really were to get into the ideas, because I think that is where the dispute really lies. Most of what they talked about wasn't really relevant, or at least it wasn't made clear how it was relevant to that key disagreement. And I tried to get them to engage on that, and I think they engaged with it just a tiny bit here and there sometimes in the open discussion. But I think Subboor did a better job at engaging with that. As I said before, Dave didn't really seem to appreciate that this was the key difference. Like, again, he sort of did sometimes, but didn't really capitalize on that or make clear what his view was. So I think that there is actually an interesting dispute to have there. But it's some combination of not realizing that that's where the real disagreement lied, and or not being interested in having that discussion. Because it's clear that Subboor was first and foremost interested in trying to humiliate Dave. And I mean, he sort of said that. I think he used the word like neutered and deselected or something. So, from Subboor's point of view, if that's what his priority is, then that's what he's going to do. Now, if you're Dave in that situation, you have to, I think the best strategy is to just call that out and say, like, Subboor's been using these terms about me, like saying I'm muted and whatever else. That's his showmanship. He can do that if he wants. I'm going to focus on the facts and the arguments, and here's what the arguments show, right? So you just kind of brush that away. I mean, that's not necessarily the only response. I think that that's generally a good response, because language like that does have an emotional pull to it, particularly if you're a supporter of Subboor, right? And so you want to think about what's the best way to try to counteract that. And it's just to sort of, I think, generally rise above it. I mean, another strategy is to just do it back, but better. That's not really my style. I think some people can pull that off. Someone like Christopher Hitchens could probably pull that off better. But it does tend to lead the debate down a different route, which is not actually engaging with the issues, which is not what I prefer. But you do have to think about how you respond to things like that. And every debate, even one that does engage very substantively, does have a certain amount of like showmanship and rhetoric to it. That is an aspect of persuasion. The issue is whether that clouds out the issues or helps to bring them to the focus and emphasize what's important and the key points of arguments. And so, again, the point is that those tools can be used for good, and that's what I like to try to promote, not using them for ill, like to mislead or confuse people. Yeah, so this point here, when Subboor was asking Dave a couple of times about like what is like somatic hypermutation, like I don't know what that is. So this is a good point, right? So in terms of what was Subboor doing there? Well, obviously Subboor is trying to humiliate Dave by presenting him as being an idiot, like not knowing what this term is. So there's a couple of things that Dave, I think, should have done that I don't think he handled this particularly well. Again, there's different ways you can try to handle it. So one is be prepared that he's going to do this. And I think probably he should have been able to know what terms he would drop. This is something I did in preparing for my debate with Subboor. I don't think he used somatic hypermutation in my debate with him, but he used other terms which I familiarized myself with. Now, that only gets you so far. You never know exactly what they're going to say, and they could always pull something very obscure. But that leads to the second point. You need to know the topic well enough to be able to credibly say whether something is important or not. Dave kind of did this, but I don't think it came across very clearly or very confidently, which is like if you know an area well, someone can still pull up something obscure that you don't know much about. But then you should be in the position to then say, this is obscure and is not important. And then that puts them on the back foot because they have to defend why it's not obscure, right? So that's a second thing you can do. The third thing you can do is just, if you're not familiar with something, don't pretend that you know what it is, or don't try to sidestep the issue, which is, I think, is what Dave did on a number of occasions. You just flat out say, no, I'm not familiar with that. Now that's not necessarily the best look, like, because you want to be familiar with things. But again, I think it's better to be upfront about it and then put the onus on them, right? Because so they're challenging you by saying, what is this? If you refuse to directly answer that challenge, then you're still accepting their terms of engagement. If you just fire back, no, I'm not familiar with that, how is it relevant? Or like, how does that support your point? The onus is back on them. Now they have to establish how is it relevant and why is this important? And you can respond to whatever they say there, like, because they're the ones who need to make the argument that this thing is relevant. What Subboor is effectively doing there by presenting it this way is he's transferring the burden of proof. The burden of proof is on him to explain why somatic hypermutation is relevant, right? That's just the case in the debate. When you bring up something, it's up to you to explain why it's relevant and how it supports your case. But he's trying to transfer that burden onto Dave by asking him what it is, as well as then presenting him as foolish if Dave doesn't know what it is. So you have to understand that that's what Subboor is doing and then be ready for it. And in fact, you can do this even if you do know what it is. Like, knowing what it is can be helpful, but you can still, but even if you knew a lot about it, you could still fall into Dave's trap of being on the defensive, like of presenting yourself as needing to explain to Subboor what it is and how it's relevant. No, don't accept that. Those are the terms that he's presenting you there. Dave, again, sort of did this, like he said a couple of times, like, how is this relevant? But you just need to be really clear and forceful about it, because I don't think he did it clearly enough or consistently enough as just pushing it straight back, asking him, you can either say, yes, I know what it is, but it's unclear to me how it's relevant, or yes, I know what it is, but it's not important. Why do you think it's important? Or no, I'm not familiar with what it is. Why is it important, and how does it support your argument? Then you let him say the thing, and then you explain, why it's. You go on to then refute, like, okay, but given what you said, it's still not relevant, right? And so you go in there, and then if you can effectively argue that what he said, like somatic hypermutation, is not important, or it doesn't refute Darwinian evolution, or whatever it is, then Subboor is made to look the fool, right? Because he's tried to create a gotcha, and you've successfully diffused it. So again, I think Dave was not really prepared for that very well, because I don't think he handled it well. And the thing is, he really should have been prepared for it, because Subboor, like he said on his YouTube, that he was going to do things like this. Obviously not the exact terms, right? But I think that this is very important when you're watching a debate, that you think about these sorts of things, because good debaters will do these sorts of things. Good in this sense, I just mean like effectively utilizing the medium. Again, I don't think that you should deploy those sort of gotcha moments like that, because they distract from the issue, but it's a technique that people will use. And so you've got to think about, like, as a participant, you've got to think about how to respond to that to maintain my case and present my argument effectively. And as a viewer, if you're actually interested in learning from the debate, you should think about, how are these effects being used to, sorry, how are these techniques being used to affect my opinion? So clearly Subboor there is trying to use this technique to make me think that Dave is ignorant of the issue. Now, is that reasonable? Well, if you think about it, not really, because unless Subboor can establish that this is like core and central and a basic thing that everyone should know, Subboor has just plucked something out of the ether and asked Dave if he knows about it. Dave could probably do the reverse if he wanted to. It's easy to find something and then ask someone else if they know about it. Like that actually doesn't establish anything, right? But if you don't think about this, it often comes across as persuasive. So it's useful to identify these techniques so that you can then counteract the natural inclination, which is just to sort of follow along, like, oh yeah, that was convincing, or to follow the emotional response or the natural inclination of how to view that interaction. You can kind of unpick it a bit. Oh yeah, so another example of when Subboor did this is when he was asking something about Aristotle, and I don't know if he mentioned hylomorphism, but he said something about that. See, that would have been a good point where Dave could have critiqued the relevance of something like that. Something like, how was a 2,000-year-old philosopher who knew nothing about genes or natural selection going to tell us anything about what we should think about the origin of species, and whether and what particular mechanisms of evolution? Like you press it back like that, right? And then again, it's Subboor who's on the back foot at having to explain how this is relevant. Arlo won the debate when he silenced Dave's video. Yeah, so that was so that video that he played that the audio didn't come through for was a bit unfortunate, particularly because it was one of his first things. I suspect it's because when he shared, he probably didn't click the share audio or something like that. It would have taken too long to debug that live. But I mean, I don't want to be mean about that, because it's not really Dave's fault that if the technology didn't work. But I would say that it's kind of a rookie error to make. So whenever you play video in slides, you have to assume that it won't work, because it just never does, right? Or very often there's a problem with it playing, or with the sound, or people hearing it properly, or something like that. So it's something you just have to test out beforehand if you want to play video in your slides. We tested the slides beforehand, but I didn't know that he wanted to play video. In general, I don't think it's good to play video in debate presentations, basically because you want to be making your argument for yourself and not relying on someone else to do it. But it can be effective to play short excerpts here and there sometimes. But yeah, that was a bit unfortunate. But I think it's partly something that comes with experience. Like, you just have to anticipate things like that. Or if you have a video, you have to have a backup if it doesn't work. So like the words transcribed or something like that. Oh, this is a very... I'm not surprised why Dave's fans won't be mad after this performance from him. I'm a bit confused by the double negative there. I think I know what you mean. It would be interesting to see how his performance is perceived by his fans. I'm not super familiar with him. I have encountered his content a little bit and watched a few of his videos. But I mean, I expect that Subboor's fans will be happy with how he performed, and that Dave's fans will generally be happy with how he performed. And if they were both targeting their performance towards their fans, then maybe they're both happy with how it went. Obviously, I'm talking about it from my own perspective here. Yeah, so this point about Dave swearing, so that was maybe an issue on my part, actually. Maybe this is a rookie error for me as a moderator. I've done a little bit of moderating, but not too much. So there was no explicit discussion beforehand about whether that would be permissible, because some people don't mind that. And some people do, right? And it's sort of not clear what the target was. I didn't feel like I could reprimand him for doing that when there'd been no explicit rule about that beforehand. and it's not like I can like censor it in real time or something like that. So yeah, probably something to think about for next time as to whether that's going to be permitted. Like, because that's not partly that's an issue of just like, do you want to have an explicit notice on your video? Or like, is it something where you want the language to be explicit or not? Like, it's I mean, it's relevant for YouTube, right? Because you have to mark whether you have certain things in your video for the type of advertisement. So like, it matters is the point. So yeah, something for me to think about for next time. Yes, well, I'm quite aware about the audience capture dynamics and the tribalism. It's not like that I was naive to that going into this. Um, I thought it would be get a bit of exposure to my channel, which is not a bad thing. It would be a good opportunity for me to practice moderating, which is a good thing for me. And I hoped that I could contribute to making the discussion a bit more what's the word I'm looking for here? Substantive. I think I underestimated how difficult that would be when I agreed to it, but nonetheless, those were my reasons for accepting it. And I'm happy with how I did overall. One thing that Subboor did a couple of times that I really disliked was trying to get me involved in the discussion, which is really like, again, it's effective as it can be effective as a rhetorical strategy, because in the context of the debate, as a moderator, I'm somewhat of an authority and somewhat of a neutral party. So he's trying to appeal to me as a way to kind of emphasize that, look, Dave's not being reasonable, but if I appeal to James, he's the reasonable one and he'll agree with me, or at least acquiesce or something like that. And it's a subtle way to put Dave down, right, to the audience. So I don't appreciate that strategy. I felt that I could have said that explicitly. I felt that might be going a little bit far. I just sort of said, I think the first time I said that's not for me to say, and the second time I redirected the question to Dave, which I think is probably the best option. But I think, yeah, if you're going to debate someone who does a lot of debating, you have to be prepared for these sorts of tactics and know how to deal with them. And I just don't think Dave was. Partly that's also for me as the moderator to be prepared for these sorts of tactics. I need to practice a bit more. I think dealing with them really well. I think I did okay. But there is also an issue with just how sort of forceful you want to be, or how much you want to allow to sort of flow freely. I generally wanted to just allow them to talk to each other fairly freely in the discussion section, because it's just sort of clear from the back and forth. Well, partly that's what we agreed to, and also partly from the back and forth between each other, like they just sort of wanted to have a go at each other. So like, that's what, if that's what they want, like I can, they can, I can let them do that. Obviously there's a limit to that, right? But I didn't want to make it, like, we could have done it as the more stilted, like ask a question, get a response, which can keep it a bit more focused. I generally think that's worse than allowing the back and forth. In this case, it may have been a little better, that it also may not have made much of a difference. But honestly, I think people in the audience wanted to see them go at each other like that. And so in that sense, got to give the people what they want to some extent. Well, thanks, Muhammad Ali fan. I appreciate that. Sorry, just looking through chat again here. This is a good point here. So debates were never a way to learn the truth in order to defend it. They are really just a way to defend oneself. I don't entirely agree. So, I mean, it depends on who's debating. I don't think that this debate was a particularly good way to learn about the truth of the issue. I think debate can be actually a very effective way to highlight the strength of two different positions, but it requires two people to be engaged with it who are going to approach it honestly and are competent both on the issue and in the skill of debating, and reasonably effective moderation. Like, I guess the more honest and competent the debaters are, the less moderation you need, but it's still a component. And there you can see the strength and weaknesses of the ideas. Like, obviously it's limited in the time, but that is also a benefit because it requires people to focus, and it requires you to really clearly identify what the point was, what the response was, what their response to that response was, and so forth, which often gets muddled very readily in like written responses and things like that, where there's just too much words and too little explicit structure. So I think there is a lot of value to structured debates. I'm actually quite a big fan. I think that they get a bad rap because, well, they often go, often go like this. But that comes about when the people are either not prepared or not really interested in engaging sincerely. Even if the moderation was stricter than I used, you can't really force people to engage, with the core ideas in this sort of structured way if they don't really want to. If they just want to primarily try to score points off the other person or just talk about your pet issue or whatever, not engage with the core issue, then they're just going to do that, and you can't force them not to. I think that one thing debates are good for is showing you how a person conducts themselves in a debate, like how they want to present themselves. You get a wide variety of different sort of personas there, which is interesting. Sorry, just again scrolling through chat here. I'm gradually catching up. Don't worry, guys. Gradually catching up. Okay, this is an interesting point here. It's important to talk about scientists' works, though, especially because Dave didn't seem to be up to date with the current discourse about this subject, which makes the debate pointless. Again, I wouldn't say the debate was completely pointless. I think that there were some points there. If you were following carefully, there were some issues that you could have trawled out of it. I mean, I talked about that like in the first half hour of this response. But the other thing is that the broad point there is I agree that Dave didn't really engage very strongly with this distinction between this idea of the need for an extended synthesis. Like Dennis Noble and Richard Dawkins had a conversation about this just recently, which Subboor referred to. So I don't know the details of what they discussed in that conversation. Subboor claimed that Dawkins was sort of wrong-footed and didn't have good responses. Now, we may suspect that he's being a bit biased in that response. I don't know. Haven't watched the video myself. But that's the sort of thing as going into a debate like this, you want to be familiar. So having watched that would be potentially good preparation, and then talking about responding to those ideas. So I think it was a mistake of Dave to just try to dismiss people like Dennis Noble as, oh, well, he's funded by the Templeton Foundation. That really is a poisoning the well fallacy. It doesn't actually address any of the points made. Like, it may be true that he's funded to say these things, but it doesn't actually tell us anything about how seriously those ideas are taken scientifically. And I don't think they've really made that point clearly, because I don't know about Dennis Noble's ideas specifically. From what I have seen, they are a bit fringe, but there are quite a lot of people. There was an issue of one of the big journals not a few years ago that maybe it's more than a few years now, because I think this was when I did my last debate with Subboor. But the point is, there've been issues of prominent scientific journals where scientists go back and forth about whether we need an extended evolutionary synthesis, whether the existing mechanisms of mutation and selection, focusing on the genes, is sufficient, or whether we need to broaden the explanatory variables or the explanatory components wider than that. And this is a point where Dawkins does differ from many other evolutionary biologists who think that the selfish gene exclusionary focused, the gene central view is too narrow. There's a dispute as to whether the core unit of selection is the gene or the organism, for example. That's somewhat different, but somewhat related as well. And Dave didn't really seem to have a clear view or much to say on these matters, which I think, does limit what you can get out of the debate, or how far the debate could go. Oh, question here. How well do I think Subboor understood Noble's arguments? Well, I mean, I don't know what Subboor understands. As I understand, he's writing his thesis about this, so you'd hope that he understands it fairly well. I am not very familiar with Dennis Noble's arguments. I have a general idea of some of the broad disputes. I don't know what Dennis Noble's argued specifically. I would say that I think that Subboor, I mean, I mentioned this before, I think that Subboor downplays for his own audience the extent to which, at least in these debates, he's accepting a lot of what would traditionally be regarded as evolution. Like, he's presenting himself as arguing against the thesis that Darwinian evolution is a fact. In doing so, he is accepting an awful lot of what most people would say is Darwinian evolution. Now, of course, he has his framework for, in virtue of which he argues that he's not doing that, but that makes it difficult. So let me step back from that. So that means that I think Subboor, while he does affirm a bunch of these positions, he does so in a way that minimizes how much I think he's really committing to, or at least he seems to commit himself to. And so as someone debating against him, you really need to call that out and make it explicit and get him to be clear about how much really he is affirming and how much he's sort of giving up on that point. So I don't. So my position would be, I think that Subboor, and this is what he did in the debate with me as well, he doesn't properly contextualize the ideas that he talks about, as in exactly what is being disputed by scientists and what is taken for granted. He focuses on things that are being disputed and makes them seem like they're bigger disputes than they are relative to what's already affirmed or what's held in common by these different scientists. Most of what is held in common, like common descent, like the core mechanisms of mutation and selection, and the fossil record and all this sort of stuff, most of that is stuff that is denied by a lot of people who oppose, at least a lot of ordinary people who oppose evolution, right? And so there's a very clear, very thin line I think that Subboor has to walk, which is being able to affirm what he needs to in these debates to make his position credible, whilst also not being too obvious about how much he seems to be sort of giving up to the evolutionists, so to speak. Oh, falling a bit behind chat again. Scrolling through. James, you're a nice twist. Dave was embarrassing. Well, thanks for saying something nice about me. I wouldn't comment on Dave being embarrassing. I do think he could have done a better job to prepare, is what I said before. Sorry, this is good. Just the other day at lunch, Taylor Swift told me, I hate people who name drop. Oh, that's good. I've got to use that one. Am I Christian? No, I take it you're a newcomer to this channel, so welcome. I did used to be Mormon. As to whether you consider them Christian, I suppose there's some debate. I do consider Mormons Christian for the record, so I do consider that I used to be Christian. No, I'm very much an atheist, naturalist, reductionist, that type of work. But I try to be fair to different viewpoints. That's what we try to do on this channel. This is an interesting point. So Subboor wanted to take a dump on Dave because Subboor doesn't think Dave's qualified. Not that it matters in the debate. So that's true. So I did say that. So in a debate like this, it is appropriate to talk about the credentials to some extent of the opponent. So because to the extent that the audience is relying on speakers to say things that are true and accurate, you do rely on their credentials to some extent, or their authority. So it's not entirely inappropriate to question that. And especially, I think that it is fair to someone who uses the moniker of Professor Dave to highlight the fact that, he's not actually a professor. And I'm actually surprised that Subboor didn't mention this more. I think he only mentioned it once and it was never brought up again. I expected Subboor to make a bigger deal out of this. So to some extent, someone's credentials do matter, but they don't centrally matter, because what really matters is whether their arguments are valid, right? And whether their evidences are good. So, yeah, but clearly Subboor really wanted to focus on that a lot. But I am surprised he didn't bring up the professor issue a bit more. I expected him to make a big deal out of that. Does Subboor title the debate wrong in your opinion? Well, I mean, this is the same topic that Subboor debated with me 6 years ago. So it's a topic that he, I guess, presumably likes to debate. What I would say is that I don't think it's a very good topic because it's so unclear what Darwinian evolution means. And phrasing it as a fact, I just find awkward. Like, I don't think that the semantics about what is a fact and theories and things is really that helpful. I didn't talk about that when I debated him, for example, because I don't think it gets you anywhere. But I think it's an awkward phrase. And I agree with Dave when he says that, like, that's just not how scientists talk. They don't say that evolution is well, actually, they do say evolution is a fact. Maybe I should. Usually they say that when they're trying to confront misinformation about science, right, or disbelief in science. But it's not really a way that scientists talk to each other. What they'll talk about is like, what is the evidence and what is the best theory that accounts for that evidence? That's more the sort of discussion you'll have. So a topic that more explicitly asks the question in that way it would be one that I prefer. I mentioned before that talking about common descent, a topic about common descent would be interesting, or a topic about whether evolution requires some kind of designer or a one-eyed watchmaker or something like that. That was a point that was mentioned sometimes. I'm not quite sure what a one-eyed watchmaker is. That would be interesting. Like, I think Dave could have, he again mentioned it, but didn't strongly draw that out as to like, what's the difference between being a blind watchmaker, which is what Dawkins thinks, and I guess William Paley is like the originator of this argument, who thinks that the watchmaker, I guess, has two eyes, right? Like, what does it mean to have one eye in this context? Be interesting to draw that out. So I think that there are better topics. If Subboor was to ask me to debate him again, I would not want to debate this topic again. I'd want to reframe the topic to, I think, something a bit more helpful. But I think that the bit, something being a fact is interesting, because that word does seem to have some pull over, let's say, non-scientists. Because if you look at how Ben Shapiro uses this, like the facts don't care about your feelings kind of thing, or there's the whole Trump and like alternative facts and stuff like this. I think that calling something a fact carries authoritative weight in at least popular discourse. Philosophically, it's not really clear that calling something a fact adds anything other than to just asserting the thing. I mean, philosophers debate about what counts as a fact, but, you know, philosophers debate about everything, right? So, but like, if I say Darwinian evolution is a fact, I don't think that's really any different to saying I believe in Darwinian evolution, or I think Darwinian evolution is true, or I think Darwinian evolution occurred. All of these things, I think, are essentially the same claim. So I think that the fact just doesn't really add anything there. It's more of a rhetorical flourish. But I think that I don't know. I'm not sure I fully understand the appeal that it has to people, but it seems like if you call something a fact, it has a strong pull, which will then be resisted for people who are, because this is why that I think creationists talk about the idea that evolution is a theory, not a fact, right? To a scientist, this distinction just doesn't really make any difference. Like, to a scientist, you have a theory that's well attested by evidence. Well, I mean, then we affirm the theory because it's very well attested and it's the best theory in town, and we think that the theory approximately describes reality. I mean, that's basically what a fact is to a scientist, right? Like something that we think is probably true of reality or describes reality. I mean, you can have, evolution is obviously a very broad statement, whereas you can have much more specific and narrow observations. But even those are theory contextualized, right? So to a scientist, like, there's some nuance there, but the distinction between theory and fact is blurred a lot more, because facts are theory dependent and theories are justified by facts. And so they kind of, or observations if you prefer. But I think that to the popular audience, that is not the case at all. And so people don't necessarily have an issue with the idea that Darwinian evolution, like, I think a lot of religious people don't have a problem with the idea that Darwinian evolution or common descent or whatever is a scientific theory which is well supported by empirical evidence, right? What they have an issue with is that it's a fact, like that it really definitively occurred, because they feel that that's threatening to their religious beliefs. It can be a scientific theory with a bunch of evidence, but it can't be a fact. And that's more of a philosophical question about what inferences you make on the basis of like a well-attested scientific theory, which relates back to the anti-realism point that I talked about before. I think that's why the word fact is in the debate here, because that's really what Subboor doesn't want. He doesn't want to have to accept all of these claims about evolution and common descent and whatever as being like definitively actually true. But yeah, personally, I think that is just not the most helpful way of thinking about things. Just looking through chat again. I still haven't, I keep talking too much. I'm not able to quite catch up, but we might get there in the end. Okay, I wish there was moderation in chat during the debate. Oh, yeah. So if you mean the YouTube chat, so obviously I'm moderating the debate as best as I could. I did a little bit of moderation in my chat. I think Nathan was also moderating things there, but the main chat came from so the debate was simultaneously cast through 3 different channels. So my channel, Subboor's channel, and Dave's channel. I think the majority of chatters were from Subboor's channel, and I can't moderate those. I don't know that there was much moderation on his end. I did see some stuff that looked like obvious spam that I think should have been moderated. So I kind of agree there. There needed to be more moderation on his end, although maybe there was moderation and I just disagree with their choices about what they threw. I don't know. But if that's what you're referring to, that's why we had that. Am I on Twitter? Well, technically I have an account, but I don't really use it. And from what I've heard about how things are going, I don't have a strong desire to. Don't people now change the taxonomy so that it's technically monkeys? Oof, I'd have to check that. My understanding would be no. I would say we descend from apes, not monkeys. But yeah, I'd have to check that as to exactly how the taxonomy is defined. But why is it more offensive to descend from monkeys than apes? That's just some weird bias there. Does it really matter? Okay, well, someone is saying here that apes are monkeys. Wait, hang on. I think I misread this. Humans are apes. Yes, I agree with that. Apes are monkeys. Monkeys are not apes. Apes are monkeys. Okay, well, if that's true, I have to look at that. But if that's true, then there you go. We do descend from monkeys. But you have to remember that that's not like extant species of monkeys, if that's the case. I'd have to look at the clades. The chat is more interesting than the debate. Well, to be honest, that's often the case. This is a good point. I don't really have much to add to that. I thought the mind and body was talking about with respect to consciousness. Yeah, he might have been. None of the speakers explicitly mentioned the idea of consciousness in the debate, so I'm not sure if that's an issue that Subboor has with evolution or something. But yeah, I mean, if you are some kind of dualist, you think that there is a spiritual or soul, a spiritual component or a soul to humans. That raises the question as to where that was introduced evolutionarily. Perhaps it always existed and that seems to imply that single-celled organisms also have some kind of soul, which some people I think affirm, but is maybe a bit extreme for some. Alternatively, there was a point in evolution in which souls were introduced, and you could ask well, when was that, and why did God intervene there? So there are questions to answer there, but yeah, I mean, it's a bit peripheral to what was mainly the topic of today's debate. I don't know if I'm ever going to catch up to it. It just seems like more keeps coming. Well, that's good. I'm glad people are engaged. I apologize, I'm still a bit behind. Yeah, the ego point is well taken, and I think that generally does lead to better discussions. One of the speakers did mention something about this will make a good clip for later, which I think, there's probably going to be a bunch of clipping of today's debate, which the problem is that gets, that does well in the algorithm. So we all got to be better and upvote better material, and then that wouldn't be the case. There's nothing inherent about the algorithm which leads it to push sensationalist sound bites like that. It's just that's what people engage with. So I think Dave wasn't super engaged with the debate. He wanted to talk about science and then kind of leave. I think that's fair. So this is an interesting question. Did Subboor just play 4D chess move on Dave? I don't know that I call it 4D chess. I don't think it's that deep. I think Subboor invited Dave to a debate where Subboor's objective was to make Dave look like he was ignorant and out of his depth, and he used the tools of debate to do that. I think that it's pretty clear that that's what Subboor wanted to do and was planning to do. He said as much, and it's sort of obvious because that's what he has practice with that. That's what he does. So I don't know that that's really 4D. I think Dave should have been aware that that's what would happen, or at least that's what Subboor would try to do. So, yeah, I guess I think that Subboor used the format to his advantage, and that's what he was always going to do. You just have to be aware of that when you're agreeing to a debate. Well, this is what so this idea that anti-realism is just being deployed as a kind of get out of jail free card to get out of an uncomfortable scientific conclusion. This is essentially, not in these exact words, but this is more or less what I accused Subboor of in my debate with him near the end. I can't quite remember his exact response. You can check the debate for yourself. Just like scroll to the free discussion section. That's probably the most interesting part. I'll put a link of that on this stream when we're done. A link to that. But yes, I think that the anti-realism point is not very strong because, first of all, I think there are good reasons to be a scientific realist about well-attested scientific theories. The fact that they're so well-attested is evidence that they're getting something right about reality. And the second point is that if you're going to be an anti-realist about, say, evolution, you should also be an anti-realist, I think, about many other scientific theories, like quantum mechanics or even Newtonian gravity or things like this. So that's a point that I asked him about with respect to consistency. I don't think you can just pull it out ad hoc whenever you want to. But yeah, I mean, some people can do that. Scrolling through chat. Not sure what you mean here, Nathan. Although you might be responding to something that I didn't talk about. Oh, this is an interesting question. The nature of the debate was science-based, not philosophical. No. I would answer that no. So we didn't specify that the debate be anything in particular. It was just like, this is the topic. I would naturally interpret a debate like this as going to have some philosophical and some scientific aspects, particularly because science is not usually in the business of declaring things to be facts. Although, again, sometimes scientists do talk like that. It's usually when talking to the general public and trying to emphasize something like climate change or evolution. They'll say they're facts to get people to believe in them, right? But just in my experience, scientists don't talk like that in scientific publications because there isn't a need to. Like, there's an general understanding about the difference between collecting raw observations and then interpreting them and saying what they say about the world. Like, observations are never self-interpreting. So you always have to deploy some theory to understand the observations, and then those interpreted observations will then be used to support one or other competing theories, and whichever theory has the best overall support is usually granted some degree of acceptance, and then the more support it gathers, then the more acceptance it adheres. So when you're talking about something being a fact, that's already, I think, generally going to incorporate sort of non-scientific aspects to it. As to like, well, what would it mean to make it a fact, for example? Also, the term Darwinian evolution is also, I mean, I don't want to say it's not used in science, but it's at least not obvious that that's primarily referring to a scientific dispute when you use that term. Anyway, well, I did my best to make them stay on topic. There's also some latitude in interpreting what counts as on topic, but yeah, I don't know. I did my best. Maybe I should have tried harder. Time to read the yearly Peter Hitchens article about how daylight savings causes heart attacks. Well, I don't know if it causes heart attacks, but it does cause confusion about time changes. Yeah, I mentioned this before. This is probably what this responds to. I didn't like when Subboor quizzed Dave, but I also thought that Dave could have handled that better. So that's the sort of thing where I think, because it's an open discussion, it is open to either participant to ask questions of the other. So it's not really on me. I think that Subboor didn't break any rules in doing that. I just think it's not good style or not good practice, personally. It's really on to Dave to how to respond to that. So I felt that it would, when it was clearly going nowhere, I a couple of times interjected, but it's on to Dave to how to initially respond to that. Yeah, when they got into like listing fallacies, like that's a very bad debating strategy. I mean, you can call out strategies, but like when you're just listing them and arguing between each other about what was and was not a fallacy, yeah, that's just very unhelpful. So tried to put a stop to that pretty quickly. This is interesting. Subboor had the opening statement. So shouldn't Dave have Subboor had the opening statement. So shouldn't Dave have responded to that topic instead of saying, this isn't the topic I agreed to? Oh, I agreed. It just came off as slightly childish. Oh, I see what you're saying. Right. Well, there was something odd about this debate, which is that normally in a debate, the affirmative side goes first. Although the topic was a question, so you technically don't have an affirmative side, but you can say that whoever says yes to the question is taking the affirmative side. So the point is that I would have said, if I was setting this up, that Dave should go first because he is taking the affirmative position that Darwinian evolution is a fact. By the way, neither speaker did a very good job at outlining in their opening remarks what their contention was, that Darwinian evolution is or is not a fact. At least I don't recall that. It wasn't. If they did say this, it didn't come across strongly to me. This is something that you always want to do as a debater. You want to make it absolutely clear what your contention is, and you want to say it like 50 times throughout the debate, with variances. But like you want people to know exactly what your position is. Generally, what you would do as an affirmative speaker is to define the topic and say, look, here's what we mean by Darwinian evolution, here's what we mean by fact, and here's what I'm affirming. Then the negative can dispute that if they want to, but it is somewhat the prerogative of the affirmative to define the terms of the debate. And it's usually unhelpful to focus the debate on a definitional dispute. Like you can mention it, but it's generally better to focus on substantive matters. So as it was, Subboor went first, and so it's sort of on him to define what the debate is about, which I think he did not do very clearly, but he sort of did. So again, Dave can dispute that. Generally, though, it's better to just take the terms as they're given and review them. I mean, if it's a tautology or something like that, obviously you can't. But the thing is, if the definition is so flawed that it's actually sort of not disputable, then you can, like, that is an argument to show that the whoever defined it that way is incompetent, because it's like there's no point in defining a debate term in a way that you can't disagree with or is so narrow as to not be disputable. Though interestingly, as I said, Subboor did define Darwinian evolution in a way where he is admitting to a lot, but he's still denying something as well. And what Dave really needs to do then, in my view, his role is to emphasize all of the stuff that Subboor is affirming, and then really try to tease out what he's not affirming and then why he doesn't affirm that. So yeah, I think that's how the debate ideally would have played out. But yeah, unfortunately, we didn't get a lot of clarity on those things. And I'm not really sure why. So this is how it went with my debate with him as well. I don't know why Subboor goes first. I mean, I think he likes to go first to set the framing of the debate. I would suggest that if he likes to go first, he should reframe the topic of the debate so that he's making the affirmative case rather than answering no to a question, which is just odd to me that you would do it that way. Oh, thanks. I try. This is an issue I should probably mention. So there was a point where Subboor did use a slur, a racial slur against Dave. This was very tactical. What am I trying to say here? This was very carefully done as well, because it's, well, at least to me, it's not a slur I'd heard before. Although as soon as he said it, I gathered the sort of term that I was, and I Googled it. The weird thing was, it doesn't seem to be a term that, I'm not going to say what it is or talk about it. That's not the point. It doesn't seem to apply to Dave. So I was a little bit confused. I think it may have just been a joke towards his audience, but because I don't really understand the context in which that's used or how offensive it is in what context, I didn't feel like I could really call it out. So maybe that's a challenge. I didn't. Yeah, I mean, because if he'd used certain other terms, I would have, but because I wasn't familiar with this one, I don't really know what to say. And it's also a bit weird if it doesn't seem to apply to Dave either. So yeah, I'm honestly not sure what the best way to have responded to that would have been. How did I learn to be such a good moderator? Well, I mean, that's a flattering thing to say. I don't think I did an amazing job, but I don't have okay, so I have done a bit of debate moderating before at a high school level. Not a huge amount, but I did a little bit. So we did have some training there. But I think mostly I've just I spent a lot of time thinking about debating, doing debating, practicing debating, and thinking about what makes a good exchange. So I try to have those lessons and ideas inform how I run things. And the key point is to try to identify the core contention and have the debaters address that and develop their arguments over time, and just try to reduce everything else as best as you can. But it's hard to be too authoritarian when you're doing that, because then you just keep interrupting all the time, and it really disrupts the flow so much that it becomes hard to watch. But you can argue about exactly how much to do that, how much that should be done. Well, yes. So Dave isn't as serious about academic debate as Subboor, because Subboor is a debater and Dave isn't. So that's not surprising, right? But Dave needs to be aware of that when he agrees to these sorts of things. And maybe he was, and he expected it to go this way, right? Maybe he's happy with how it went. Like, I don't know, but yeah, I mean, I agree that kind of showed in the way that he performed. Yeah, I agree, Fenton. I don't want to show the slur up here just in case, but Fenton said he Googled the slur and he's more confused. Yeah, that's that was my response. I'm like, I don't understand how that's applicable here, but I'm like slightly concerned. All right, maybe I'll eventually scroll to the end of this. So someone's saying here, Subboor was not a good ambassador for Islam. Well, as a non-Muslim, I can't fully comment on that, but he was pretty condescending and demeaning, and he wasn't very charitable towards Dave. Now, it's pretty clear that wasn't his objective. If you judge him by what his objective was, then that's he wasn't trying to accomplish that. But in general, I just think that that's a better approach, and generally looks better for people who judge you based on like what kind of perspective you're from or what worldview you endorse. There's a limit to that as well, because I think it can go the other way, which is what Nathan sometimes calls civility porn, where you just really emphasize how generous and kind and civil you're being, and kind of almost use that as a substitute for genuinely engaging with arguments. It's funny that I remember Christopher Hitchens. I'm getting confused. Christopher Hitchens said something about this in a debate. This was many years ago, obviously, when he was still alive. It was a debate he had with a bunch of apologists. And I think like the moderator and then a couple of the Christian apologists said something like about how great it was to be there and to have this discussion and how important it was and blah, blah. And then Hitchens was just like, all right, we're here. Like, great. Can we stop congratulating ourselves about it? Like, it's not that amazing. Like, can we just get on with the point? Like, which is maybe a little dismissive, because it is important to, be civil. But at the same time, I don't think, I think you can go over the board and pat yourself on the back too much about the fact that you're being civil, and use that as an excuse or a way to avoid actually grappling with the core issue. So I don't have an issue with people being like, harsh and direct on criticizing ideas, but you should distinguish the ideas from the person. And, there's things that Subboor did that I wouldn't agree with, like just doing the quiz thing, for example, and calling Dave names, which of course Dave did in return, and which I don't think is a good look personally, and not helpful. Just looking through chat here. Probably need more. Well, maybe I don't. Oh, yes. Okay. So this is, didn't Dave constantly ask what anything Subboor said had to do with the topic? Yes, he did. And I think this is a response to what I was saying before, that Dave needs to call out the fact that Subboor's appeals don't, or it's not clear how they establish the topic. Yes. So Dave did ask this a number of times. So that's good. But you have to do more than just ask the question. So one thing is that when you're debating, you're talking to the audience, or at least you're trying to persuade the audience. Like, you might pose a question to your interlocutor if you have a back and forth. But it's not enough just for Dave to ask Subboor, in my opinion. It's not enough for Dave to just ask him, how is this relevant? You also have to make the case that it isn't relevant. Like, you have to show that. Dave could have said, like, so Subboor, you've said this a number of times, but you've never once explained how it substantiates your point that Darwinian evolution is not a fact. Because I think that, I would argue, or appeal to some scientific principle or whatever it is that you're discussing specifically, that is part of Darwinian evolution. And so you're actually supporting my contention when you talk about it. You're actually agreeing with me that Darwinian evolution is a fact. So, that was just off the cuff. But you see how there's a difference there in that I used whatever like hypothetical points Subboor was making, and then clearly said like, I can affirm this. It doesn't support what you've said, that Darwinian evolution isn't a fact. It supports what I've said, that it is a fact. I clearly link it back to the debate and make a case that it supports what I've said. I mean, that was very generic, but like, it's not enough to just ask the question, because it's not clear. It doesn't become clear in the audience's mind that that's actually what you're doing, that you're actually, that you have to make it clear that this point supports your contention, not just ask the opposition to better argue their case. Like, that in itself isn't making your case for you. It's a small step on the way there, but it's not sufficient in a debate like this. And it often doesn't come across very clearly to the audience. You have to really hammer that point home and make it very clear and draw the link back repeatedly. Yeah, I think this is true. Didn't do his homework with Dennis Noble. He should have been able to do that. I mean, it's not a secret about the topic of Subboor's thesis, so he should have been able to do that. And I think this is fair. Subboor used a lot of rhetoric and a lot of appeal to authority, which, there's a place for some of that, but I think that I agree it was overdone, and that was clear that it was his strategy to do that. Okay, from Nathan, if you know so much about debate techniques, then why didn't you defeat Maverick Christian's garbage mental states? Maverick Christian, did I have a discussion with him, or did we just, I can't remember what our interaction with him was. But I should also say that some of what people call debate isn't actually a formal structured debate. Like, I can't remember Maverick Christian, hang on, isn't he the one who I was having a discussion with, and he was like reading from his paper? I think that's the one. that was funny, if that's what I'm thinking of. So things like that are not actually structured debates. They're conversations, and that's a fairly different format. Anyway, I'm not sure how serious that question was, or if I even am remembering the right person. I think this is the point that Dave really needed to emphasize. Again, he sort of mentioned it, he appealed to it, but it wasn't clear and forcefully pressed enough. Subboor agreed with almost every point about Darwinian evolution, but couldn't admit that it accepts him that means it commits him to accepting it being a fact, and then talked about neo-Darwinianism or these other mechanisms. Dave needed to tie that together more clearly and forcefully. Scrolling through here, still trying to reach the end. I think I'm gradually getting there. Stormtrooper mug. Oh, yes, someone may have seen this. Yeah, this is a gift that I received from a tutoring client, actually. It's actually in the shape of a stormtrooper. Sorry, it's blurring out there. How do I turn this off? Bugger. This is why you shouldn't do these things on stream. How do I? Sharing a window. No, I don't need to share that. I want to show you my mug, dang it. I can't find it. Oh, here it is. Jeez, it should be easy to do that. Okay. Yes, here it is. It's actually the shape of a stormtrooper's helmet, which is pretty cool. The inside is not the shape, though. It's just like a cylinder. You may also note stormtrooper pillow, if I can point there. So I'm a bit of a fan. For the Empire. Anyway, I should probably get going soon, but I do eventually want to scroll to the end of chat here. Yeah, I already talked about that. Would I bring Subboor in for a chill stream someday? I'll think about it. Yeah, there's people who are... I am concerned about the slur, and there's people who've made some points about that. I won't get into that here, but yeah, again, that's fair points. Yeah, people talking about that again. I mean, I guess how much of a problem is a slur if it doesn't apply to the person? I mean, it's still a slur, right? But it seems to be worse if it does potentially apply. So I'll have to think about that. I might actually ask Dave about that, because that is, yeah, if Subboor did use a slur that's potentially applicable to Dave, as opposed to just something random that doesn't make a lot of sense, that's something that needs to be called out. I might ask Dave about that, actually, and I might put a disclaimer on the video or something like that, because I think that's actually a pretty big problem. I mean, it's an issue even if it doesn't apply, but I think it's like worse if it does. People generally acknowledge that. Should a moderator define the topic and what it means for a debate? Well, traditionally, no. So the moderator just moderates. It's sort of tautological. The moderator facilitates the timing and the speakers interacting with each other and staying on topic, but the moderator doesn't decide how to define the topic, essentially because that's often contestable as well, and it's an important component of the debate. And so, I mean, I guess you could set it up so that it's done that way, but often that would just lead to arguments between the moderator and one of the debaters, so it just wouldn't really work very well, I think. The guys who were walking past behind Subboor, I thought that was a bit unprofessional. He should have blurred his background or something. I don't know why they were in the room. I thought that was pretty funny, though. It was just like these people going past, like, what's going on there? Oh, dear. Try not to laugh. I feel like this debate was more of a clash of pride and ego rather than presenting their ideas and proving their side, which was seen during the build-up to the debate. I don't really disagree. I think, but that's kind of what they both wanted, though, at least to a significant extent, which is why there's only so much I can push back against that, at least from my point of view. Yeah, this is a fair point. So Dennis Noble is not arguing for the extended evolutionary synthesis. He calls his view the third way. I'm not sure what the other two ways are. One of the ways is like intelligent design, isn't it? I think. Oh yeah, that would be, because it's the one-eyed watchmaker or whatever. Yeah. So no-eyed, the blind watchmaker would be Dawkins. That's that one way, and then the second way would be like the two-eyed watchmaker, which would be the intelligent designer. So the third way is the one-eyed watchmaker. Right. See, I'm not super familiar with his ideas either, right? But that would make sense. It would be nice to have that brought out and discuss what that means. But I was talking about the extended evolutionary synthesis because some of what Subboor has appealed to, some of those non-mutation selection mechanisms are referred to under a term, the extended evolutionary synthesis. And you could argue that the extended evolutionary synthesis is, so some of the people who make the case for those argue that Darwinian evolution, quote unquote, is not sufficient to account for, like those traditional mechanisms aren't sufficient to account for all of the aspects of biological form and function, because we need these additional mechanisms and aspects. And so that's something that you could potentially appeal to defend the position that Subboor wants to defend. But again, I'm not saying it's the only way to do that, although that's exactly what Dennis Noble is doing. And this is a fair point. Extended synthesis is taken seriously and discussed. The third way is not. Also fair enough. I don't know exactly what the third way is. But I guess it's not clear that Subboor needs to commit himself to either of those. Like, he can argue for both if he wants to. He just needs to make the case that something beyond the Darwinian mechanisms, however he wants to define that, is required. And yeah, I think he is muddying the water a bit there, what he's appealing to, and not being clear all the time about which ideas he's accepting and which he isn't. Do I think that Subboor pretends to agree with more of Noble's arguments than he actually does to have more of credible points he can use? Possibly. I don't know enough about what Noble exactly argues to say, or indeed about exactly what Subboor believes about evolution, for that matter. But it wouldn't surprise me. This is a good question. I don't know how many Subboor and Dave fans we have in chat here, but what are honest areas? I think, what are areas where you honestly think they fumbled, or something to that effect? And that's a good thing to think about. Like, whenever you watch a debate, if there's a particular person that you are a fan of or society you support, good to think about, what did they do wrong? What could they have done better? As a way to avoid, just exclusively supporting your side and getting all tribal about it. I'm feeling a bit like Sisyphus here. I just can't get, I suppose if I just scroll really fast, I'll get to the end, but I want to at least look through and see if there are things worth responding to there. in chat here. Please keep it in English. I realize there's some non-English getting in here. Sorry, I might be a bit selective about this. So the reason for that is just I can't moderate language that I can't understand, right? So you could be saying anything. How would you say your experience was with Subboor if you didn't mind going into it? Well, you can watch the video of my debate with him last time. That's one of the reasons I agreed to this, because while I disagreed with Subboor's positions and I thought that he was kind of cherry picking a bit to represent science as being more in support of him than it really was, I found him pleasant enough to engage and interact with. Like I've debated one other Muslim before about a different topic. I didn't find him nearly as pleasant. I felt like Subboor actually at least engaged with some of the things that I was saying, and we could have a productive discussion about it. So that's why I was willing to moderate this time. So, you know, I don't want to overstate to the extent that I know him, which is not very well, or that I agree with all of the tactics that he used today, which I don't. But I mean, yeah, on the basis of last time, I felt that he was at least someone I could work with and have a discussion with. So that's the basis on which I agreed today or one of the bases on which I agreed to moderate today. There's quite a bit of non-English slipping in here. Nathan, can you help me with deleting this if you see it? I may need more moderators, or maybe not many of my normal chatters are here. Still scrolling. That looks bad to me. It was awful on Dave's channel. I'm not sure if you mean chat, but I can believe that. Seymour Butts is such a funny name. Sorry, like I don't even find that offensive. That's just good. Yeah, this is the point. Like, we can be an ape but not a monkey. Like, we have to draw a line that there's, you know, this far, no farther. So I'm guessing these are the names for the clades, or I'm not sure which taxonomical grouping these are. Yeah, I'll have to check that. I do actually want to do a podcast episode on human evolution sometime soon. It's been a few years since I've looked into this, so I'm a bit rusty. Well, we can descend from something and be that thing. I mean, we descend from animals and are animals, right? So there's no contradiction there. You just have to be clear about your words. Yes, there's this new world and old world distinction. I need to check that. Dave's performance was dominant, especially for viewers who understand or care about science and logic. I can't really agree. I don't think that Dave was very good. Like, I think that the scientific claims he made were accurate, but I don't think he was very good at following the logic of the discussion very well, or responding to a lot of what Subboor said. And he did make a lot of personal attacks as well. Subboor did too. And you could say Subboor started it, but it started long before this debate. So I don't think deciding who's most to blame is really very useful. Ooh. Yeah, well. 1D checkers, yeah. Yeah, actually. So someone asked before if Subboor's strategy was 4D chess. It's more like 1D checkers. I think that's a more appropriate analogy. Like, it's not really that deep. 60 Russian roulette, yeah. I heard a funny joke about this, that there was a recent study of like 630 people who played Russian roulette, and all of them survived. So on that basis, we should conclude that Russian roulette is a completely safe game. Dave kept telling Subboor to stick to the topic, but Subboor kept changing it. I think that Subboor was not always very clear. The thing is that I wrote down, I mentioned this in the moderation, I wrote down Subboor's definition of Darwinian evolution. Now, he claimed to have said that in his opening remarks. I didn't get that from his opening remarks. Maybe he did and I missed it, but I got it from I think it was his rebuttal. that he defined Darwinian evolution, Subboor, as random mutation plus natural selection can generate mind and body. So that's how he defined it. I don't know if that was a change from something he said before, or whether he just wasn't as clear as he should have been in defining that, because that's not something you should miss. Like, it should be very clear what your definition is for both speakers, and I think that they both could have done better there. But once Subboor did give that definition, I don't think, well, yeah, I don't know about every claim that he made, but I think generally he was consistent in focusing on that was his issue, that those mechanisms are, his view was those mechanisms are insufficient to generate mind and body. And I don't think he defined what he means by mind and body very well, but that was his view. I don't think Dave understood what Subboor's point was. Like, I mean, Subboor's point was somewhat vague, but the idea that these mechanisms are insufficient, we need more mechanisms, let's debate about those. I honestly don't think that Dave really got that point, or at least if Dave did get that, I don't think he articulated what his response was or why he thought that was wrong very clearly. Because like I was trying to grab on any thread to connect them together, and I just, yeah, I didn't get that there was a clear response forthcoming from Dave to that. So I think that Dave said that Subboor keeps changing the topic because Dave didn't appreciate what Subboor's objection was to evolution. At least that's how I understood it. You know, go back and listen to each thing they said, and I may have missed some points because I was trying to do a few things at once. Thanks, Mahmoud. I appreciate that. I did what I could. Oh, geez, I am crazy far behind. I haven't even been looking at these timestamps, which I should have. So I'm nearly half an hour behind. Oh, well, it's it's going all right, me having a conversation with chat from half an hour ago. Okay, so the title is Darwinian Evolution. In fact, Subboor redefined the topic mid-debate to talk about Dennis Noble and Neo-Darwinism. Well, he introduced those things in his first speech. I think Subboor didn't do a very good job at defining that, what the topic was in his first speech, but I don't think you can say he only introduced those things midway, because he talked about them from the very start. But I mean, you know, we can debate about that. I agree that it could have been clearer. Well, like, honestly, about the slur thing, like, maybe this is an issue that I hadn't thought about, that it's hard to moderate something if you're actually not aware of the salience of certain words, because, like, you can read that something is a slur, but there's slurs and there's slurs, right? Like, some are genuinely offensive and some are just used differently. Like, it's really the social impact that's important. And that's something it's sort of subtle cultural knowledge. So that's something I hadn't thought about enough before. Yeah, more people talking about that. At this point, both of them were sick of each other and wanted to go at each other. Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty much it, exactly. And I sort of knew that going into this. So, you know, I did what I could. Again, I would encourage people to think about, well, maybe this is propping myself up a bit. Consider a counterfactual in which they didn't have a moderator, or the moderator cared less about trying to get them to behave. I mean, it could have been worse. I've actually seen worse. So, yeah. It is good to be able to mute people live, which I only did once when Subboor just kept talking over and not allowing Dave to respond. So that's actually better than I thought. I'd have to mute people more. So in some sense, it could have been worse. They were at least generally willing to, after some coaxing, allow the other person to talk. There are some people who just won't. They'll just keep going or keep yelling. I mean, this is not good debate practice, right? But sometimes that can require very firm moderation. Determined to prove Zeno's paradox. I don't know why I didn't notice the timestamps before. I was just looking at the words. I think I am getting closer. Now, this is interesting. Why does the Stormtrooper mug designate you as an atheist? I'm actually interested in, like, what the cultural connection there is, because I feel like a lot of people like Star Wars. If Growing Pains, if you have a point there, because I'm genuinely interested in that. I know it's kind of a joke probably, but I'm interested in these sort of connections that people make. Oh, good point. Yeah, I forgot about the connotations of the Empire these days. Oh dear. Yeah, thanks, Nathan. You said you did some moderating there. Appreciate that. Who won the debate? I'm surprised no one else has asked that before. Well, maybe the winner was the friends we made along the way. No, if I was to judge this purely on the basis of the rules of debate, I would have to say Subboor won the debate because I think he did a better job at articulating a thesis and defending that thesis. I don't think he did a great job, and I've said a whole bunch of things that I think were not great, but I think Dave did a worse job at that. So if I was grading them on that criteria, and things like the structure of their rebuttal and other things like that, I think I would have awarded the debate to Subboor, but I would have had words for both of them about some of the things that they did. And again, I would emphasize that when you can judge people on different levels, you can judge them based on like the formal criteria of debating. You can judge them based on like, did they achieve their objectives? You can judge them based on how fair were they with the arguments, and those are all different things. Oh, and you can also, I almost forgot, you can judge them on who was right. Obviously, I agree more with Dave's view than Subboor's view, but well, I think for the most part, yes, although Dave's view, I don't think was well articulated, but like, I think a lot of what Subboor says about evolution requiring additional mechanisms is like probably mostly wrong, but there's some truth to it. But, you know, it's a very technical issue that I don't have a strong stake in and is best left to scientists, I think, to work that out. I mean, and to some extent, there's philosophical aspects to that as well. But the point is, you can judge these things in different ways. Judging by the rules of debating, I would say Subboor won. Judging based on who achieved their goals better, I don't know. I think Subboor achieved his goals. I don't know about Dave. Possibly both did. Judged on who behaved themselves better, I'm going to pass on that one. Judged on who was more right, I think I'd lean Dave. Because I think I'm closer to his view than Subboor's, but it's actually quite hard to say because often they didn't engage with the core issues very well. So I don't know. There's your confusing answer to who won. Well, thanks. Because I mean, ironically enough, one of the things that I always say is don't just believe something because I say it or anyone says it. So I'm not sure what logical paradox that ties you into. I agree that I won't believe something that you said because you said it. Actually, that reminds me of that scene from is it Life of Brian? Yeah, it's like he's trying to persuade people not to follow him as the Messiah, right? And he's saying, think for yourselves, you're all individuals. And then, you know, hundreds of people in the crowd chant in unison, yes, we're all individuals. So, you know, it's a bit like that sometimes. Okay, I'm only 10 minutes behind. We're racing to catch up. I have no idea where in chat you are. While I'm there in chat. Well, I'm certainly not replying to most messages. I'm looking through and seeing what things are of interest to me to comment on. Because I think there are a lot of interesting comments in chat. Of course, there's a lot of guff as well, but you just ignore that. Farina supporters were saying he cooked. Supporters were saying he cooked. Well, does that really surprise you then? Like that always happens. You're getting the truth here, which is the real impartial facts. No, I don't pretend to be impartial, but you know, obviously I have a bit of a different take. Dave is not a good debater. That was my sense of it, at least. I don't think he performed well, like in the context of judging a debate. I think he wasn't very well prepared. But again, that may not have been his goal. So you always have to bear that in mind. Like if you're going to judge someone, what was their actual goal? Was their goal to do the thing that you think they should have done? And you can say maybe they should have done that thing, but they achieved what they wanted to do. Just, you know, always a bit of nuance there. Yeah, I commented on this before, how Subboor tried to involve me in the debate. Yeah, I think that's not a good tactic to use. But as a moderator, you have to be aware of that sorts of things and just pass it off, because it's not appropriate to involve a moderator in the debate. Okay, I'm actually really close now. Only 6 minutes behind. Evolution shapes bodies, doesn't create them out of nothing. Well, actually, that's an interesting point, because evolution doesn't say anything about where the first cell came from. It's usually thought to only apply once we have cells. I mean, people talk about molecular evolution. Maybe you can apply similar principles to go back further, but it's not abiogenesis. It's not a theory for the origin of life. That's actually an avenue that Dave could have taken as well, in response to Subboor's definition of what was it again? Creating body and mind, is to say that, well, in a sense, he's right, but he's misunderstood evolution, because evolution is never a theory about creating body and mind, right? It's a theory about how, in a sense, bodies and minds, I mean, taken very simplistically to the extent that a single cell has a body and mind, but like evolution is a theory about how those change over time and the mechanisms of that. It's not a theory about what creates them originally. So that's another avenue that Dave could have taken. Since when a debate is allowed to give their own definitions, interpretations of scientific concept doesn't make any sense. Well, let's be clear about what I said here. So in a debate, you can say literally whatever you like that the moderator doesn't forbid you from saying, right? It's up to the opponent to call you out if you say wrong things. So the moderator doesn't decide what is true or correct or accurate, or whether something's a fair presentation of the science. The point is that the opponent that's their job, right, to call that out. So it's always incumbent on debaters to define their topics, and they can define them however they like, which can include in a completely misleading way, right? It's up to the opponent to respond to that. I suppose there's some limit to that, right? I mean, if because I do need to decide what is on topic, but I can't be the one to adjudicate exactly what the bounds of the topic is. I can adjudicate if something is grossly off topic, like if one of them started. So, for example, if Subboor started, like he mentioned briefly about the not being a professor thing, but if he started to go into a sidetrack about, I don't know, Dave's history with how he makes money on his channel, or some business that he did in the past or something, like that's clearly off topic. And I would say, please focus on the debate topic, right? There's obviously gray area there about what you can and cannot say. How far can you stray? If Subboor started talking about general relativity the whole time, I'd say, like, Subboor, please explain how this is relevant to the debate, right? But ultimately, you're not the arbiter of what is true in a debate as the moderator. You're just there to facilitate the format. Well, this is, again, the terms are supposed to be agreed beforehand. That's not generally true in a debate, so that the terms will be brought up and discussed during the debate. A debate should be self-contained. I would say that it can be helpful to define the terms beforehand between the participants, just so that they don't talk past each other and that the audience gets more out of it. But in general, that's not true in a debate, that you have agreed upon terms beforehand. Because the problem is that often if you frame the topic or question in a certain way, that will favor one side over the other. So fixing that rigidly is generally not feasible. And it's, it's a subtle art to determine when to challenge the definition and when to just accept it and argue it on its own terms. You can't be too fixed about this, I think. I think you, as a moderator, one of the few people who got Subboor's point of contention. I think that's fair, yes, because I don't think Subboor's main point was to make his contention really clear. His point was to humiliate Dave, right? So I agree with in that sense. I still think Subboor was a little clearer on that he was making that point than Dave was, because Dave, the only thing I could say really about what his key contention was is that here are some scientific facts about evolution. But that's not a thesis, right? You really need to have a thesis, and I'm not sure what Dave's was, apart from these certain things being the case, most of which Subboor at least claims to agree with. So yeah, again, judging it on the debate terms, I do have to give it to Subboor, but that's not to say that there weren't a lot of things lacking from his case. But yeah, I mean, I think that did make it harder for Dave to respond. But there's various things that he could have done there, I think, better. Only true Messiah would deny his divinity. Yes, exactly. Which is actually an interesting argument, by the way. But let's not get into Christian apologetics here. Did Fodor comment on questions why he's an atheist? I don't recall seeing a question of that here. And that's not something I'm going to answer today. Just watch my other videos if you want to know what it is. That's too big to answer. I am addicted to eventually. Like, this was supposed to be like, well, I didn't actually set a time to it. I didn't think it would go for 2 hours. Yeah, quick chat. It's going to be a quick chat. But I'm going to get to the end of this. I'm 5 minutes, right? 5 minutes. spam chat, he gets stuck for hours. Well, the engagement's still good for me, so like, can't complain too much. A biogenesis is a big issue, yeah. But B biogenesis, yeah, true. I think Dave should have gone quiz mode on Subboor too, and that would only be fair. I think you should have stepped in as well and stopped Subboor after he repeated stacking for the 50th time. So I think he did it maybe 3 times, 2 or 3 times. I did step in on the 3rd time. The thing is, it's okay for a person in a freeform discussion, in a freeform format like that. It's okay for one person to ask the other a question. That's not actually against any rules or prescriptions that we made. It's important to give. So it's important, I think, to allow him to ask the question, then to give Dave the chance to respond to the question the way he likes. Like, Dave doesn't have to answer the question. If I thought it was important to keep the discussion moving, I could insist that he answer it. I mean, you can't make them, right? But you can, which I did a couple of times. I like further encourage them to do so. But the point is, I did want to leave it as open to Dave as to how to respond to that. Because he can respond to it by addressing the question directly or linking it back to the debate or asking a question himself. Like, there's a bunch of ways he could have responded to it. And he had a chance to pose his own questions if he wanted to. So, should I have intervened a bit earlier sometimes? Maybe, but it's a judgment question about how much to be prescriptive about the discussion. And mostly I wanted them to be, to go back and forth with each other, as long as there was at least some semblance of it was going somewhere. When they got to the point of like debating about which fallacy someone had committed, like at that point, it's just like, this has completely gone off the rails. Let's bring this back. Or a couple of times I tried to really get someone to answer a question directly when I thought it would really help. But yeah, I didn't. Like, we could have set it up as a Q&A, like one asks a question and the other responds and goes back. That's a format that I've seen. I don't actually think that would have been better if we'd done that. And I didn't want to be too prescriptive about saying, well, Dave, now you ask him a question, because then that sort of sets up a format that we hadn't agreed to. Anyway, it's tricky. It's tricky. And I'll learn from this experience. So at this point here, Dave just sticking to the science and saying Nobel's ideas aren't worthy of consideration because they're fringe. Pseudoscience isn't terrible. It's not terrible. The problem is that you need to make the case that they are fringe pseudoscience, because you can't just say that they are. Like, in a debate, even if you're completely correct that what the person is saying is fringe pseudoscience, that's just not enough of a rebuttal. Like, if you're debating an anti-vaccinationist, for example, maybe everything they say is complete nonsense pseudoscience, contradicts known science, as a misstatement of the facts, but it's not enough just to say that. You have to argue it. And that's, like, if you don't want to do that, you shouldn't agree to a debate, because that's the whole point of the format. So, but like, you may have different objectives, and you may simply only be interested, I said this before, about, I'll talk about the science and ignore everything else. Like, that's a strategy. It's against the terms of like how you're supposed to engage with the debate. And so if I'm marking you on that criteria, you're not going to do well, but it may meet your criteria for success, your personal ones. I caught up, guys, I caught up. Wow. Look, I can type a message and it will appear. All right. So this point here, Subboor brought up some valuable critiques of natural selection without realizing it, as well as the gene-centric, or maybe, I think he means Subboor here, as well as the gene-centric perspective of evolution, which kind of went over Dave said. Yeah, Dave didn't really latch onto this point about a gene-centered versus an organism-centered perspective of evolution, which could have been good. Actually, here's a good avenue on that you could take right now. You could say, look, this is an important debate. However, if we're thinking about Darwinian evolution in terms of the key mechanisms that Darwin understood, Darwin didn't know anything about genes. And so making that the distinction that defines what something is Darwinian is not an appropriate definition. So by any reasonable understanding of what Darwinian would be, you can't force genes to be into it. And therefore, like, you can't define that to be a gene-centric method approach, because that's not Darwin talked about. He talked a lot about organisms, in fact. So like that would be a strategy in responding to that. It does get a little definitional, but anyway, like, there's lots of strategies. It's just when you go into a debate like this, you need to be prepared for how you're going to deal with these sorts of things. And Dave wasn't prepared. That was, I think, pretty clear. And I don't think he did a very good job listening throughout the debate to try to, I mean, this is what I was trying to do as a moderator, is listen to what each side was arguing so that I can help them engage with that. And I don't think Dave was really doing that, or at least I don't think he did a good job. Or if maybe he did and just decided he didn't want to engage that way. But either way, I don't think he did engage with some of those core issues very well. Kropotkins, no, I have not. Maybe I should. Yeah, and by the way, there's probably going to be response videos from both on this. I'm likely not going to pursue that discussion further. I wanted to do a reflection here, and that's probably going to be the end of it from my point of view, unless unless anyone highlights something that is particularly relevant for me to respond to. But in general, I'm not going to do like responses to further responses. Yeah, if you're going to create debate creationists, you have to know they're talking points and arguments. Well, that or just be big knowledge of the fact that you're not going to respond to what they say and you're just going to ignore that, which is an approach, right? But has its own flaws. I think you could have had a more productive convo with Subboor. Well, you're in luck because I already did. You can watch that video. I'll add the link. Just a moment. All right, I think that I will finish up here. I'll give people a last chance if there's any last burning questions. Now that I finally caught up with chat, it only took 2 hours and 15 minutes. So now's your last chance. If there's a last burning question you wanted to ask me about the debate or the topic, do so now. Otherwise, maybe I'll just talk briefly. So I probably need a bit of recovery after today's marathon session, like 2 hours in the debate and another 2 hours today. I think there is a BA coming up. I'll liaise with Nathan about that. And probably the next video I'll be working on is a response to that 9-hour video defending substance dualism. That will take some weeks to prepare. So I don't know exactly when that will be ready, but maybe weeks, maybe a couple of months. And it'll probably be an edited few-hour-long video. Don't worry, I'm not going to do a live response to a 9-hour video because then I'd just be literally at it all day. All right. Yeah. Surprising rebirth. 2 weeks time BA. I think that's Easter or something, isn't it? Yep. So I need to start doing a reading for that. Okay. We have a question. If you are coming at a science debate with a religious tint, that's not a question. I'll just ignore that. Let's say that's a comma. Does it make sense? Does it make it less scientific? Oh, geez. I'm struggling with the grammar here. If you're coming at a scientific debate with a religious tint, does it make it less scientific? I'm not sure I understand the question, to be honest. So let me just answer generally from what I understand. Debate topics aren't labeled as scientific or not scientific. That's up to your interpretation as to how to pursue it. In general, I think that it's not helpful to circumscribe yourself to only using a certain type of argument. So like, I'm not going to use any philosophical type arguments or historical arguments, only scientific ones. Generally in a debate, you can use anything anything you can get away with. I would say appropriately, anything that's persuasive and logical is what you should use. And so often that's going to take some components from science and some from philosophy. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's just, are you doing it well or not? I don't know if that really answers the question. No worry. Crazy Dov, thanks for coming. Do you think Dave could have presented himself more professionally with body language? Well, yeah, there's a lot of things he could have done differently. I just don't know that he wanted to. How does religion bias scientific debates is the question. Well, if people are engaging in these because they have religious motivations, and of course that's going to bias things in a whole bunch of different ways. Like clearly that's what Craig does when he appeals to science as well. I don't think it's a problem that people have an ideology, but if your objective is to show that, you need to do your homework and be able to show that clearly, like how it's biasing. It's not enough just to say, but this is what the science says and stamp your foot. That's not persuasive in a debate. Well, it may be persuasive to some people, but it's not really engaging with the format or going to be persuasive to people who don't already agree with you. Well, yeah, but everything is performative. Like you write a scientific article, that's performative too. I mean, I guess, yeah, there's a difference, obviously. But you got to know what you're dealing with in that format and use it effectively to achieve your objectives. And ideally, if you find someone you can work with to produce a meaningfully constructive discussion, then it can be very helpful, I think. A structured debate can be very useful. Or it can be just largely a bit of a circus, a bit of a slinging match. Often, there's a bit of a mix of both. But, there's worse ways you can spend an afternoon, I suppose. Did Subboor ever clearly define how his version of Darwinian evolution differs from the standard scientific definition? Well, there's 2 points I would say there. One is that I don't know that there is a standard scientific definition that's relevant to all of the points that were being made, because there is an active dispute amongst scientists about how best to understand some of the nuances of evolution. But if by common scientific understanding you mean the things that are broadly agreed upon, then no, I don't think Subboor did explain how his view differs. I think what he was trying to do is affirm everything that is consensus, essentially, and make a point about some of the things that weren't. Now, whether he actually would commit to that, like theologically or philosophically, I kind of doubt, given my past discussions and other things that he said. But I think from the purpose of the debate, he was trying to maintain this position where he didn't want to dispute anything that is widely accepted. So in that sense, you can take what he was arguing as a very narrowly and technical scientific issue that is not settled. But the thing is, I think that he also wanted to draw broader philosophical conclusions from that. And this is what I think, if Dave was to engage with Subboor, like on the terms of the debate and the topic that Subboor wanted to argue, Dave needed to appreciate this and respond to that and really get Subboor to articulate clearly what the difference was, and for Dave to hammer home how much Subboor was conceding, and how little a basis Subboor has for whatever philosophical or theological claims he wants to make, or whatever he does want to deny. I just don't think that really came through very clearly. So I think I disagree with this, because I think I did have a constructive discussion with Subboor in my debate, at least parts of it. I mean, you can make your own mind up about that, I suppose. I'm a monkey descendant and here for stealing the match. We actually had a thumbnail on one of our BAs, I recall, literally showing that. I can't remember which one that was. That was I liked that. I liked that thumbnail. Yes, this stream is pre-recorded. I also pre-recorded your comments and my responses to them. That's one of the powers that I have in this crazy universe. All right, that's enough from me. Thanks everyone for your support, comments, and engagement. Overall, I think this was an interesting experience and a learning experience for me. I hope people got something constructive out of all of this. Take care, everyone. It's a bit crazy out there these days. I'll see you soon.